filed. What's your expectation in the coming moments? And is it a good idea for them to move quickly and unseal these federal charges?
Yeah, I think it is, Vicky, because there will be speculation swirling around what the actual charges are. So the sooner the indictment is unsealed, the more we can all speak in an informed way about precisely what charges have been brought, and even more importantly, what the evidence is supporting those charges, because I am hopeful that we'll see what we call a speaking indictment. There are two ways to indict somebody of a crime. One can simply be, on such and such a date in Florida, Donald Trump committed the crime of false statements or obstructing justice, which tells you almost nothing about the evidence supporting that charge. However, particularly when we have these large, consequential special counsel investigations, we saw some of this in the Mueller Trump-Russia probe, the prosecutors, the special counsel will feel it's in the national interest to do what's called a speaking indictment. And it reads like a narrative. It can actually be quite compelling. It can read like a novella. It can lay out the history of the background of the charges, the evidence supporting the charges. And that's when we can begin to assess for ourselves the quality and quantity of the evidence.
Thank you so much for walking us through that process. When what we may see, if it reads like a novella, I think everyone will jump on those details. Legal analyst Glenn Kirshner, thank you so much. We want to go now to an NBC News special report.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day and welcome. We're coming on the air with breaking news. The federal indictment against former President Donald Trump has just been unsealed, and we're learning new details about the 7 charges he's facing over his alleged mishandling of classified documents after he left the White House. It comes after we first learned about the indictment last evening. This is the first time a former president has been charged at the federal level. The special counsel who led the investigation, Jack Smith, is also expected to make a public statement later this afternoon. Let me go right now to senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett. Laura, you've had an initial look at these documents. What are you seeing?
A remarkable set of circumstances here, Lester. Some revelations that we are learning for the very first time now that this indictment has been formally unsealed by that judge in Florida. I should mention there are 38 counts. This involves an alleged conspiracy between the former president and his body man and valet, Walt Nauta, someone who authorities believed had not been fully transparent about his instructions and moving documents around Mar-a-Lago, highly classified and classified materials. I want to point you to, in particular, some new revelations here. Some of this had come out from reporting, but some of it had not, Lester, including here an allegation made by the special counsel that, in fact, the former president showed materials to others who had not had authorization to receive them on at least one occasion in July of 2021 at his Bedminster Club. This has been something that's been reported on, where it was actually transcribed and taped, where he talked about a, quote, plan of attack that he said was prepared for him by the Department of Defense. The special counsel goes on here to describe another instance where he showed a document to someone who was not allowed to receive it, someone from his political action committee. And the special counsel alleges that that happened in August or September of 2021. So we have here willful retention of national defense information. That's the Espionage Act that we hear so much about. We also have here a conspiracy, as I mentioned, with his body man, Walt Nauta. So we're going to continue to go through this.
All right, Laura, I know a lot to pour through. Thanks. We're going to pause right now our coverage very briefly. So some stations are going to return to tennis. For the rest, we'll be back in a moment. All right, continuing our NBC News special report for the rest of the country right now. Laura, you were walking me through some of the revelations in this now unsealed and essentially now public document, the indictment here. Does this go into great detail as to what allegedly occurred?
Yes, Lester, this is what you call a speaking indictment. This is where prosecutors are offering for the first time in their own words their story, their accusations against the former president. There's been a lot of reporting about all of this for quite some time now, but this is the first time we are actually seeing it in the prosecutor's own words. And the revelations are stunning. The special counsel has accused the former president on at least 2 occasions in 2021 of showing classified documents to others who are not allowed to receive them.
And to be clear, in the one instance, he's acknowledging that these are not declassified documents.
That's correct. And the reason that's important is it goes to his state of mind. It shows that he actually understood the classification process. He understood his limits, his authority. I should mention, again, these are 2 different circumstances, one of which we had never heard of. The first one that happened in July of 2021, that happened at Bedminster. That one you've seen a lot of reporting about that. But this second one that the special counsel said happened in August or September of 2021, we had not known about him showing a member of his political action committee other material that's highly classified or classified. And I should mention here, again, this is the first time we are seeing official confirmation that he's been accused of participating in conspiracy with his body man, Walt Nauta.
All right, let me go to NBC's Garrett Haake. He's been covering the former president and joins us near his estate in Bedminster, New Jersey. Garrett, tell us the reaction you're hearing from there.
Well, Lester, we've not heard any reaction from the former president to the indictment being unsealed specifically. But remember, it was he who scooped the Justice Department last night by announcing that he would be indicted in the first place. He subsequently gave an interview and said he intended to plead not guilty to the charges, whatever they ended up being. Donald Trump and his political staff have really been preparing the ground for this moment for quite some time. They've been trying to condition Republican voters and Republican elected officials to see this as an attack by the Department of Justice, an attack by liberal prosecutors, an attack by his political rival, Joe Biden, meant to keep him out of the Oval Office. That's been his consistent line on the stump. He's released multiple campaign ads, one through his campaign, another through a super PAC supporting him, echoing those same claims. And you're seeing it pay political dividends for him now, with even some of his leading rivals for the 2024 nomination echoing his same language about this being a political prosecution. But Lester, given the details in this indictment, it is possible that some of that could change as lawmakers and others look through what we've all just seen publicly unveiled.
All right, Garrett, we'll ask you to stand by. NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos is here. The two of you essentially have been tag teaming. It's a lot of information to go through. What has struck you so far?
Not a lot of surprises. We're seeing a lot of concealment of document statutes, the withholding of documents, the even destruction, conspiracy. Although the alleged co-conspirator may come as a surprise to many, it isn't that much of a surprise when you consider that the government in this case is going to be looking for people that they can charge in addition that may eventually become ideal cooperating witnesses. And what better person to maybe consider an early plea deal than someone who is a close aide to the former president. Not a big surprise there that there might be conspiracy, because we knew all along that, at least according to Trump and his team, this was at least one of their supposed defenses was that, hey, other people were doing this beneath me, possibly without my knowledge. So again, not a big shock to see that other people may have been implicated in this entire documents fiasco.
Let me raise the question that was raised in the New York indictment a couple of months ago, and that is, under other circumstances, a different defendant. Is this the kind of case that would lead to an indictment?
Well, it's interesting. In cases like this, where people take away national security information or classified documents, traditionally the government has gone after those people. They haven't always charged exactly this set of crimes in this combination, but this is a very unique circumstance. I mean, rarely do you have a situation where a former president who has a different status than other traditional defendants who are charged with, say, concealing government documents, destroying them. The president is going to be raising a lot of different defenses that flow directly from the fact that he was at one point the president. Arguably, that may be why this case is venued in Florida. It could be that the government looked at the conduct in D.C., realized that much of it happened while the president was the president, and that might raise some presidential immunity issues, or at least motions that would gum up the process. So the government figured, well, since most of the conduct that happened while he was ex-president, that's something we'll have no problem charging. charging him on, they decided, I'm guessing, to bring it down in Florida, to clean that up, make it an easier, more streamlined process, and avoid the inevitable motions, which may slow down the process.
On that point, you can both comment here. For the initial part of this case, the judge in this case was appointed by Donald Trump. What does that mean in terms of going forward? Is that something that the prosecution may raise an alarm about?
I doubt it. I mean, the view that folks should take is that, yes, judges should consider recusal when warranted, but we have never had a situation like this where any president or former president who is charged, virtually every federal judge could potentially have that conflict, because every single federal judge is appointed by a president. So if it's a judge that was appointed by Trump, you might have the government saying, well, maybe we should get a different judge. But believe me, if this had been a Democrat-appointed judge, you'd be hearing the exact same thing from the president's defense team. So it's probably not going to be the case that merely because a political opponent's side appointed the judge and one side perceives that as a disadvantage, that alone would not be enough, even though Trump himself appointed this judge. And ultimately, Lester, it's a jury that decides this case. Even though the judge decides critical motions, and there will be many before this case gets to trial, ultimately it comes down to 12 members, 12 peers, 12 people from the community in this venue. All
right, let me go to former U.S. Attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. He's also an NBC News contributor. I'm not sure how much you've been able to read of these documents so far, Chuck, but I'd like to get your first thoughts.
Yeah, one of the things I look for as a former prosecutor, Lester, is evidence of intent, indicia of consciousness of guilt. One of the counts is fascinating. They're all quite interesting, but I'm looking at the one that involves a conspiracy to obstruct justice with his aide, Walt Nauta. According to that count, Lester, Trump used one of his attorneys, identified only as Trump Attorney 1, and urged him to conceal information from the FBI, moved documents and boxes around, even to conceal them from his own attorney. And so by trying to use his attorney in this scheme to evade the FBI and to not respond to a grand jury subpoena that was issued to him, he ends up with another count in the indictment against him. Evidence of intent is incredibly important. Government has to prove that these crimes were committed willfully and intentionally, not by accident or mistake. And so obstruction of justice really plays right into the government's hands. It helps them meet that burden of proof. It helps them establish intent. And without intent, you don't have a crime. Accidents and mistakes and inadvertence are not crimes. Intentional misconduct, intentionally hiding or destroying documents or suggesting that your lawyer do that is a crime. And so when you see that in an indictment, you can almost hear the government's arguments at closing as it asks the jury to consider convicting this man, convicting him because what he did intentionally, and evidence of that intentionality is found in his efforts to obstruct the investigation.
All right, Chuck, thanks very much. Well, that is going to conclude this NBC News special report, where we're going to continue our coverage on our streaming channel, NBC News Now, and, of course, this evening, full coverage when I see you for NBC Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt in New York. Thank you for watching. We'll see you a bit later on. Welcome back to our NBC News special report after the federal indictment against former President Trump was just unsealed. In other words, made public with a bit of a narrative as to what the government alleges. Let me bring back our panel here. Laura, I think you had a point you were going to make before we went to the break.
One of the more interesting parts here is how you see the prosecutors laying out the former president's intent. This is not somebody who regularly uses email or text message, but they have plenty of receipts and text messages messages from those around him, including his valet, and appears to be how they have built their case, including using his own attorney. As you might recall, Lester, they actually were able to pierce through the attorney-client privilege and get certain materials from his attorney against his own client, which is highly unusual, but it can happen in situations in which the government can prove that that advice was used in furtherance of a crime, which is what the prosecutors are alleging here. Again, remarkable allegations that Trump actually directed his body man to move the boxes, to evade the attorney's review of those boxes, to conceal from his own attorney, is apparently the theory of the case. Again, some of this we had known through reporting, but it is the first time we are hearing it from the U.S. government.
What do you both make of the fact that two members of his defense team have left since we got word of the indictments?
One of the things I've heard is that this could have to do with the fact that, for example, Jim Trusty is a D.C.-based lawyer in this case, is now brought in Florida. I don't buy that at all. This is a federal case. Other than having to fill out some forms and paperwork and get admitted pro hoc in the Southern District of Florida, which can be a hassle, overall, federal practice is federal practice. You hire local counsel to help you with the local procedure, but if you feel you can continue, and you've handled cases like this in D.C., you can handle them in the Southern District of Florida. So that reasoning that I've heard, I just don't find plausible. There must be some other reason, maybe some disconnect between strategy for the client and the attorney. Happens all the time. It happens a lot with Trump and his lawyers. So maybe not a surprise. It could be something as simple as Trump wasn't delighted with his attorney's appearance on the networks last night and in the last 24 hours. But I don't know how to read too much into that. But I imagine that the overall defense strategy will remain the same. They will argue, and they've already put out the narrative basically, that they were being picked on, that they were willing to work with the federal government. Federal government set arbitrary deadlines. They wouldn't allow rolling production, and that the defense here was willing to try and return these documents, and the federal government jumped the gun. That will be the central theme of the defense here.
Laura, what about defense strategies?
It's interesting that their best defense strategy all along had been that Mr. Trump knew nothing about the movement of these boxes and that the White House merely swept them in and he knew nothing about it. This document that we have in front of us, this lengthy document, lays out a very different story where he is intimately involved in the movement of all of these boxes.
In this Bedminster conversation was recorded, Trump also said, according to this indictment, as president, I could have declassified it. Now I can't, but this is still a secret. So those are the words that take away some of that defense.
It shows that he understands the limits of his authority when he's no longer president. When he's president, of course, he can declassify. He has the broad authority. And so when he talks about declassifying things in his mind, this statement from his own mouth shows he understands that not to be the situation, that not to be true.
Is this the kind of case, take away a former president, is this the kind of case that would often lead to a plea deal?
In the ordinary case, I would say yes. Just start with the statistics. 90+% of all federal cases, and I know I've been beating this drum, Laura's heard me say it 50 times, that 90+% of federal cases end in guilty pleas. Of those that go to trial, 90+% are found guilty on at least some of the counts. So just looking at the numbers off the bat, yes, almost everybody pleads guilty in federal court. Federal court is a very difficult place for criminal defendants and criminal defense attorneys to be. Given the choice, almost all of us would rather be in state court. And that's because the federal government, when they make a case, it stays made.
And not to go too ahead of our skis, he is innocent, obviously, until proven guilty.
But presumed guilty. Innocent.
Innocent, of course, but in a different setting, you might expect something like that.
In a different setting with another defendant, you can expect, and I think if you look back on similar charges like this, you see a lot of willingness or actual guilty pleas. You look back just during some of the outgrowth of the Mueller investigation. I believe you had former General Flynn. You had some of the other folks who were charged in connection with some of these major investigations in just the last few years. Some of them raced in when they were charged with crimes like Section 1001, which is false statements, false material statements. They came in, they pleaded guilty. Some of them even cooperated as cooperating witnesses. Most of these cases end in guilty pleas. That being said, and of course, Trump is presumed innocent, in all likelihood, this is the defendant that will never plead guilty, because there are those defendants in the world of white-collar crime and in federal cases that are firmly convinced that they did nothing wrong, and all they need to do is get their story out there. And that's exactly what Trump has done. He's gotten it out there on social media. He's gotten it out there at his rallies. He'll continue to do so. I would say there is zero chance that this is a defendant that would even contemplate pleading guilty.
But that's where his legal peril and his political interests might bump up against each other. Obviously, you read through a document like this, and in perhaps the normal case, this is a situation in which someone would look at this and decide a plea might be in their best interest. But he's been fundraising since he was indicted in the last case. He has managed to use what is, for any other politician, a devastating situation to his political advantage.
Well, you just walked me into the next lane of our conversation. Let's go to our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. Yeah, what about the politics? There's a conversation.
We're going to be talking about that, I think, for the next 18 months, Lester. You have seen some people in the broader Republican orbit say publicly that they wanted to hold off on making any kind of judgment related to these charges until exactly what we're all talking about here has come out, right? Until the details of the indictment have come out. We just heard that, in fact, in just the last couple of minutes from former Vice President Mike Pence, somebody who obviously knows Donald Trump quite well, somebody who is now officially going up against Donald Trump to try to win the Republican nomination for the White House. Chris Christie is somebody else, again, a competitor to Donald Trump now, an official candidate who has said he wanted to wait and see what the details are. And the details, as we've been talking about here, Lester, in this indictment are frankly extraordinary. They are extraordinary. Even though some pieces of them have been publicly reported in other outlets and by us in the past, there is plenty in here that is new and that is significant. When you talk about the legal liability that Donald Trump faces, Laura and Danny and others have laid out his state of mind based on his own comments about knowing that the declassification process needed to have happened while he was in the White House. But I want to direct you to a different section, too, related to what Chuck was talking about on the obstruction potential piece of this here. That Donald Trump, after being subpoenaed, had a conversation with his attorney where he said things like, wouldn't it be better if we just told them we don't have anything here? He said things like, well, look, isn't it better if there are no documents? In one anecdote relayed by an attorney, Donald Trump made like a plucking motion, as though indicating to this attorney he wanted him to simply pluck some of the more sensitive documents out of this folder at question and at hand. These are the details that are significant, that speak to where Donald Trump's head was at in the days after the subpoena had been issued. I also want to point out that, again, while we had, I think, a pretty good idea of what kind of sensitive information was in these documents, the types of documents that the former president had, we are hearing this now formally and officially of what this was. These were, according to the indictment, information about U.S. nuclear programs, information about the weapons capabilities of the U.S., our military vulnerabilities, our allies' military vulnerabilities, plans for what we would do in a foreign attack. And you can also see the indictment lays out the variety of agencies, including the CIA, the Department of Defense, et cetera, who had documents wrapped up in this. There's these photographs in the indictment, Lester. They're sort of treated, colorized, if you will. They're not specific photos, but they show, for example, the way that these boxes were stored in bathrooms in one instance, in a shower in one instance, spilling over and revealing top secret information that somebody came in and sort of saw and said, I wonder what we should do about this. And I'm paraphrasing here. I think it gives remarkable insight into what was happening at Mar-a-Lago, in addition to everything else that we're talking about here. Donald Trump's personal involvement in determining what to do with these boxes at hand. So, bringing it back to the political question, Lester, right? You have to think that right now, in Iowa, in New Hampshire, in South Carolina, where these various Republican candidates are, they are doing exactly what we are doing, which is looking through this indictment, watching the news reports about it, looking to see what the Department of Justice has. You have seen some people, I think of his allies in Congress, like House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, even before this indictment dropped, come out with a full-throated defense of the former president. Some have questioned the Department of Justice and cast doubt, echoing Donald Trump in that respect, on the what they describe as partisanship at the DOJ, but stopped short, I'm thinking of Nikki Haley here, of backing up Donald Trump personally himself. Will this indictment change that calculus? We're going to have to see probably in the next couple of hours on that.
Yeah, and we should note again, Jack Smith, special counsel, we will hear from him. We're told at 3 o'clock Eastern time that there will be no questions, but he will make a statement. Let me bring in former federal prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb. Carol, if you could follow up a little bit of what we heard from Hallie about others in Mr. Trump's orbit and how they relate to all this.
Yeah, so Walt Nauta, his personal butler and aide, both at the White House and at Mar-a-Lago, has been charged along with Donald Trump in this conspiracy. And the last count of the indictment, count 38, just shows that he just out and out lied about his participation in moving the boxes at Donald Trump's behest. I do want to point out a couple of things. One is that the scope of this indictment and the charges in this indictment don't necessarily depend on these documents being classified, even though that's been a big subject of discussion, both by the former president and by the media, because we didn't know what the charges were going to be. It's the hiding of sensitive documents that he was not permitted to move from his office, but it doesn't necessarily depend on their being classified, although many of them were. Just to get into specifics, and Hallie mentioned this one in particular, I think paragraph 66 of the indictment, where one of his attorneys told the government that after putting together the documents to deliver to the government upon its request, Trump said, what's in there? I think he said, is it bad, good? Did you find anything? And then he made a plucking motion to the attorney as if to suggest if there's something bad in there, pluck it out. That's the kind of information that's very important for Jack Smith to have put into this indictment. It is what we call a speaking indictment. That's very different from the kind of indictment that was brought in New York by Alvin Bragg. This is a speaking indictment, so nobody can really question what the basis for this indictment was.
Carol, can I pick up on something you and I talked about as this was breaking last night, and that was the decision to go before the grand jury in Florida. Reading what the government has here, does that seem like a particularly shrewd move?
I don't know that it was a move that Jack Smith necessarily made because he thought tactically it was better for him to do that. I think, just the fact that the case is now before Judge Cannon, who presented some difficulties for the government, to be sure, in the search warrant of Mar-a-Lago. I think that Jack Smith looked at the whole situation and said, most of the crimes actually did occur in Florida. I don't want to have all the legal problems that could arise by stretching and bringing these charges in Washington, D.C., because defendants are entitled to be charged in the district where the crimes occurred. There are sometimes continuing crimes or conspiracies where you can find venue in another district, but in this case, I think Jack Smith made the call. The right place to bring these allegations was in Florida.
Carol Lamb, thank you. Let me bring in Catherine Christian. She's a former Manhattan assistant district attorney and an NBC News legal analyst. Last time we spoke was the day of the former president being indicted on state charges here in New York. And toward that, knowing that there are other cases still out there, are we potentially looking at a traffic jam of prosecutions? And what is that going to look like?
Well, practically, it's for Mr. Trump, it will be a mess because he has the Manhattan indictment. He has this indictment. He has a civil fraud case with the New York State Attorney General. He has an upcoming defamation trial, part 2, with Jean Carroll. He possibly has, if the Fulton County, Georgia district attorney gets an indictment in Georgia. So practically, it's hard to see how he's going to be on the campaign trail. He may be saying that he is going to be, but he's going to be going from courtroom to courtroom. Obviously, trials cannot happen simultaneously. The respective prosecutors will talk to each other. Usually it's the first case goes first, but federal court tends to run faster than state court. It's just the way it is. So practically, it's hard to see how he's going to keep up, this campaign, but he probably will. I find it interesting in this indictment, and I'm not a speed reader, but the special counsel uses Mr. Trump's words against him. When he was running for president, on page 9, he spoke, and I'm sure this was a dig at Hillary Clinton and about her emails. He spoke about how when he became president, he will protect classified information. The special counsel also includes a statement that Mr. Trump made in 2018 when he was president, when he said how important it is for the national security secrets of the nation be kept secret, particularly for people who leave office. So I think it's very important that the special counsel put that page into this indictment and put it before all of the charges, because we're speaking about knowledge. Clearly, this is a man who knew the importance of keeping secrets, national security secrets secret, the importance of classified documents. He said it in 2016. He said it when he was president. So it just shows the willfulness, alleged willfulness and knowledge that this former president has done.
All right, Catherine, thank you. We'll ask you to stand by while I turn to NBC News legal analyst Kristen Gibbons-Fedden. Let's talk for a moment here about intent and how the government sees that in this overall narrative.
Yeah, and I would agree with Carol is saying, because it's really interesting how the government was very thorough in exactly what they wrote and delineating the willfulness both while he was running for president, during the time he was president, and then all of the statements that he made after president, which not only show, as Carol was pointing out, the willfulness, the intent, and the importance of these documents, but it also goes to the classification of the documents and really bootstrapping that with the obstruction of justice charges, because then when you go down through the indictment as a whole, you saw the government actually delineate what type of documents they were. Talking about some of these documents dealt with intelligence, talking about nuclear capabilities. That is extremely important in classified secret information. Military capabilities, military attacks by a foreign country. And I thought this was interesting. Military capabilities of a foreign country. Those are information that, if gotten out, could really also affect our international allies, because depending on what information got out and who it got out to, that can really impede the security of not only our nation, but other nations as well.
All right, Kristen, thanks. Let me turn back to my panel here. And Danny, let me start with you. We're talking about some deep security secrets of this country. How do you do a case like this and not put that stuff out in the public realm?
There are actually special procedures for cases like this, normally used in the District of Columbia because it happens most often there. But certainly they'll have to be followed down here in the Southern District of Florida, even though it doesn't happen nearly as often as it happens up north in the District of Columbia.
So we're not going to see descriptions of weapon systems from foreign countries in the public view?
Absolutely not. And not only that, the government has to guard against the defense's use of discovery. They have to turn over that discovery to the defense, but also ensure that it's not gray-mailed, so to speak, that the defense doesn't use it in a way, or any defense that you hand over these kinds of sensitive documents to, that they don't handle it in a negligent way or even handle it. I'm not saying that's what Trump's defense would do, but there is an incentive to maybe say, hey, look, we have these documents. You know, do you really want to be handing these over to a defense if you're the government and worry about whether someone's going to email it out to somebody and then it's going to get hacked or something like that? So there are a lot of very sensitive procedures that have to be followed. What we will perceive, I suspect, is that will take the form of delay. Anything like that adds delay to a case, because you're going to have redundant systems to make sure that these documents don't fly around through the internet, and that may involve extra security procedures. So believe me, the government is very mindful of this. You can see that in the indictment. They don't let out anything that is damaging. They just contain the bare minimum they need to let everyone know, to let the public know that the nature, the categories of documents that were sensitive.
That's one of the reasons there was always a risk not to bring this case in Washington, D.C. Of course, Washington, D.C. judges in the district court are so well versed in the process. They know the statutory process. They're so familiar with it. I think the idea was that they wouldn't have allowed for there to be a delay. Doesn't mean that federal judges in Florida aren't well versed in it too, but DC judges go through this all of the time. And so that is a risk that, of course, the Justice Department appears to have felt it was more important to get the venue right? Of course, the venue is something that's constitutionally required. You have to charge it where the crime, at least part of the crime, happened. And you go through this document, and it's very clear they believe all of the operative acts happened in Florida, even though it appears he actually caused boxes to be moved to New Jersey, to Bedminster, because it started in Florida. That's where they're charging it.
Can I ask you about Jack Smith? He's going to speak in about 40 minutes from now. We'll leave it to others to judge if that's necessary or not, but what expectations would you have? What do you think that...
It's interesting that he's going to actually speak for the first time since his appointment last winter. We have not heard a peep out of him, but by design. He's playing this by the book. This is an experienced former prosecutor, a war crimes prosecutor who has sort of a dogged, aggressive reputation, but also he's playing this case by the book by not making a single statement about it, never giving a press conference.
But by speaking, is it an acknowledgement, though, that this, there is a political
I think he
sphere
has to fill the information vacuum. There's already been, 12 hours now with the former president and his allies attacking this case without us actually having our hands on the document. And so I think this is an attempt for him to explain himself, explain how he's reached these conclusions, and explain why this whole thing is not some political hit job the way that Mr. Trump has alleged.
And then, Danny, what's the other investigation in January 6th? Does that move that quicker now, or where does that leave that case?
I think we see that moving independently in a way that it always has. And of course, I think that would be venued up in D.C. And now, especially now that we're here in the Southern District of Florida on the documents case, I think it provides even more separation to a January 6th investigation, whether or not that investigation ever results in indictments at all. Those cases, I imagine, will proceed completely separately because this is a clear message that the venue is going to be separate. It's going to be here in Florida. And, my prediction on Jack Smith, I think you're going to see minimalist approach to speaking. He's already spoken. It's right here in the indictment, in the 50 pages or so of a speaking indictment where they lay out in plenty of detail, without going into too much sensitive detail, what they believe happened.
Well, my thanks to both of you for walking us through this and getting through that material very quickly and offering some great analysis. Appreciate it. That concludes this NBC News special report. We're going to hand off our coverage to my colleagues Ellison Barber and Vicki Nguyen right now.
Lester, thank you so much. Welcome to NBC News Daily. I'm Vicki Nguyen.
And I'm Ellison Barber. We continue to follow breaking news in the unprecedented legal peril facing former President Donald Trump. He is now the first president in American history to be indicted on federal criminal charges. Details of the indictment were just released and include 7 charges, a total of 37 counts. Here they are. 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information, and 1 count each of the following: false statement and representations, conspiracy to obstruct justice, withholding a document or record, corruptly concealing a document or record, concealing a document in a federal investigation, and scheme to conceal.
It is a lot to digest. This case involves Trump's handling of classified documents after he left office, and this went on for months, is the allegation. Trump refused to return the documents despite multiple requests, which then led to that raid, you remember, of his Florida home in August of last year. President Trump breaking the news himself Thursday night on social media about this indictment.
This is warfare for the law, and we can't let it happen. I'm an innocent man. I did nothing wrong. And we will fight this out just like we've been fighting for 7 years.
On Tuesday, the former president is expected to be at an arraignment at a federal courthouse in Miami. Today, the Secret Service is meeting with Trump's team to plan the complicated logistics of that appearance.
Also complicating the situation, the 2024 presidential election, where right now Mr. Trump is the Republican frontrunner. President Biden is, for the most part, staying quiet, but said this to our Peter Alexander on Thursday before the indictment was revealed.
Mr. President, what do you say to Americans to convince them that they should trust the independence and fairness of the Justice Department when your predecessor, Donald Trump, repeatedly attacks it?
because you notice I have never once, not one single time, suggested to the Justice Department what they should do or not do relative to bringing a charge or not bringing a charge. I'm honest.
All right, we've got NBC News correspondent Garrett Haake standing by outside President's home in Bedminster, New Jersey. Garrett, so this indictment came out just a few minutes ago. We're reading through it as you are, I'm sure, 49 pages. What stood out to you? What are you learning right now about these charges? And they're calling it a speaking indictment. Walk us through what that means as well.
Yeah, Vicki, look, that means that there's a stunning level of detail in here, a narrative of exactly what federal prosecutors believe Donald Trump did to break the law in all of the counts that you just outlined. The indictment describes an effort by Donald Trump and his aide, Walt Nauta, as they were leaving the presidency, both to pack up boxes and boxes of his personal documents, to have them shipped to Mar-a-Lago, where he was setting up residence after the presidency, where then they were stored in places like a bathroom or on stage of the ballroom and moved back and forth between Mr. Trump's residence and this storage area, even as the government's effort to reclaim this documents was going on. So you see evidence of both of this kind of improper storage and of an effort to conceal from the government what documents exactly Mr. Trump had. And the specifics of those documents are also damning. The indictment goes into pretty good detail in describing the kinds of classified information that the former president had. National security secrets about America's nuclear arsenal, about the strengths and vulnerabilities of our allies and of our adversaries. Documents produced by the CIA, the Department of Defense, the National Security Agency. These are not, schedules and things that might have had classified markings on them that would perhaps be no longer secret. These were serious documents related to national security, and the indictment spells out that Donald Trump knew all this. It includes transcripts of conversations that he had contemporaneously here in Bedminster, New Jersey, and in Mar-a-Lago down in Florida about the kinds of information he had and the effort to keep it away from federal prosecutors and to show it off to other people. So really an extraordinary document that I will be very curious to see if it changes the minds of any of those in the Republican Party who've kind of rushed into the void here between Donald Trump's original announcement that he had been indicted and the publication of the specifics to defend him on this case. The details here are much harder to defend.
Yeah, Garrett, just to remind viewers a little more of one of those moments in 2021 that you referred to that took place at Bedminster. There is a detailed transcript in here on page 15 where Trump is having this conversation with Margot Martin, who is working on a book. He mentions to her, shows her, according to this, one document, and at one point says, "I just found, isn't that amazing? This totally wins my case, The staffer then says, He says, except it is like highly confidential. The staffer says, yeah, laughing. Trump says, secret. This is secret information. Look at this. And then it goes down and he talks about saying this was something done by the military, given to me. I think we probably can write. The staffer says, I don't know. We'll have to see. Yeah, we'll have to try. And then Trump says, declassify it. See, as president, I could have declassified it. Now I can't, but this is still a secret. Garrett, that's a conversation we heard so much about. One of the big things focused around this is the fact that this is not just speculation. This was recorded. What can you tell us more about the significance of that conversation? Remind viewers who was in the room at the time. When we talk about Margot Martin, who was she? Would she have had any sort of classification to even hear about these in any sort of setting?
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that story captured in this indictment, Ellison. Margot Martin was a junior press aide in the Trump White House. And at the end of the Trump presidency, she became one of two political staffers still on the Trump payroll, traveled with him to Mar-a-Lago, still travels with him frequently as a press aide. Absolutely not someone who would have any kind of significant security clearance, at least not to be able to review anything at a high level of classification, and certainly not in the public sphere. After having left the White House, she would have also been part of this discussion, which we understand was with ghostwriters who would have been working on Mark Meadows' book. So there's different elements of this. People who were presented with these documents in real time and hearing these conversations with the president, they're important. The specific details about this idea of I could have declassified them then, now I can't, are important for two reasons. Number one, it speaks to intent, which is always a challenge for prosecutors in a case like this. Did Mr. Trump know he had something he wasn't supposed to have? This conversation suggests, yes, in fact, he did. This wasn't just an innocent mistake. Second, ever since this search on Mar-a-Lago in August of last year by the FBI, Mr. Trump has repeatedly said that he had the authority to declassify these documents at any time, including in one interview suggesting he could declassify them just by thinking about it. Well, this transcript indicates that he didn't declassify them, and he didn't even think about it. He knew at the time he was presenting them to other people that they were still classified. Again, a significant piece of evidence just in that one anecdote that helps build up the special counsel's case.
Garrett Haake, thank you. We want you to stand by. We want to bring in our NBC News senior Washington correspondent and NBC News Now anchor, Hallie Jackson. Hallie, I know you're busy poring over all the pages of this indictment as well. Something that stood out to me, it's on page 24 and 25, where the special counsel was able, the attorney general was able to talk to one of Trump's attorneys, only labeled as Trump Attorney 1. Yeah. Saying that Mr. Trump asked that attorney, did you find anything? Is it bad? Yeah. Is it good? And then Mr. Trump made a plucking motion, and the Trump attorney number 1 said, he made a funny motion as though, well, okay, why don't you take them with you to your hotel room? And if there's anything really bad in there, like, pluck it out. And that was the motion he said. He didn't say it. But this, as we talk about this speaking indictment, these kinds of details really paint a picture about what was happening in those rooms that we have not known about until this point. Hallie, what else stood out to you? What does this indicate about what actually happened with the handling and concealment potentially of these documents?
There is so much. There's so much here, Vicki, and it is, as you and Garrett have been talking about, and Ellison, this really extraordinary document. So to the point that you're making, what I'm going to shorthand here as the plucking anecdote, if you will, the reason why there's getting to be a lot of attention on this is because of what it signifies about what Donald Trump's mindset was. Did he know he was doing something wrong by having this sensitive material, these classified documents at Mar-a-Lago? And this plucking anecdote, right, seems to speak to that. That is clearly why prosecutors have put this in the indictment here, as they're charging him now with these federal charges along with his personal valet. What is also interesting here is the way that Trump, the former president, then, when agents actually came to review these documents, pick up that first tranche of documents, or I guess it would be the second tranche of documents, told them he was an open book. He said to them, well, yeah, I'm an open book. That is obviously belied by what we know from earlier in the process here, weeks earlier, when after the subpoena had been issued, the former president, when talking about documents, materials he had, said things like, wouldn't it be better if we just told them we don't have anything here? And, well, look, isn't it better if there are no documents? The reason why these details matter, and I get it, right? And let's just be real. A lot of rolling coverage here. There is a lot of information, I think, coming at people. I cover politics for a living. I'm very steeped in it, right? I think that the big takeaways for folks should be this, okay? Donald Trump is now obviously becoming the first president who is facing these federal charges. This indictment is explicit in laying out the many ways, as they lay out here, right, as they put into this document, that Donald Trump was not forthcoming when he knew that he had these classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, right, when he knew that the Department of Justice investigators, that FBI agents wanted these documents back, and was personally involved in making sure that these documents were moved from places other than where they needed to be. The level of personal involvement from Donald Trump is also interesting here. There's one point where he talks about where he actually changed his travel plans. Typically, he goes up to where Garrett is in Bedminster for the summer. He's in Mar-a-Lago at his Florida home in the winter. He changed his travel plans, according to this indictment, to be able to be at Mar-a-Lago when these FBI agents showed up to collect documents. I'm not talking about the search here. That was in August. I'm talking about when the attorneys for Donald Trump called and said, we found these several dozen documents. This is all we have. That obviously turned out not to be true. You flash forward to August, and they found, obviously, dozens more documents. The other piece of this, and this speaks to a little bit of what Garrett was talking about here, and the political nexus here, because remember, Donald Trump is not just the former president who clearly was having access to these national security secrets even out of the White House here. He is the current Republican frontrunner in the race for the White House right now. We have seen some members of Congress, for example, his allies there, some Republican contenders who are competing against him here, come out and defend Donald Trump already. Some have cast doubt on the Department of Justice and echo Donald Trump's claim that this is a partisan sort of witch hunt investigation. This very clearly lays out something else that is also at the nexus of, in many ways, conservative orthodoxy, which is the importance of national security and making sure that the U.S. does have a national security apparatus in place that is robust, that is safe, and that is putting the U.S. at the forefront of being ready to take on whatever may come. And I think that is why, big picture, this indictment truly is, it's just very striking. Again, because we've never been in this position before. We've never had somebody who was a president get indicted on federal charges before. And so to see these details, I think, is really notable. There's obviously lots more here. It kind of depends on where you want to go with the conversation. So I'll stop talking and throw it back to you.
A lot of receipts in these documents. Hallie, stand by for us for one second.
We want to bring in Ken Delaney, and he is with us now in Florida. He is NBC's Justice and Intelligence correspondent. Ken, you look at these indictments. There are two names on the top here. It's not just Donald Trump. It's also Walt Nauta. Tell us what we know about him, and specifically when we're looking at the case they begin laying out in this indictment on page 3 about obstruction, how Walt factors in.
Well, it's alleged that Walt was part of the obstruction conspiracy, that he essentially helped Donald Trump cover up and conceal these classified documents from prosecutors. And, he was given an opportunity, we know from our own reporting, to come clean and cooperate. And he declined that. And his lawyers are paid for by Donald Trump's super PAC. So he, as of right now, is on Team Trump. We'll have to see whether that changes. But look, I just want to step back for a second. I've covered the intelligence community for more than a decade. I've covered a lot of these unauthorized disclosure cases. This is one of the most devastating and detailed indictments I've ever seen in this realm. Just last week, an Air Force intelligence officer who took home 30 top secret documents, no allegation of obstruction of justice, no allegation that he showed them to people who shouldn't have seen them, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. This indictment is far more devastating than that case because, in particular, you have allegations that Donald Trump not just took the stuff home and lied about it, but showed this material on at least 2 occasions to people who weren't cleared to see it. And the indictment clearly says that the stuff that Donald Trump had included secrets about the United States nuclear program, foreign and U.S. weapons system capabilities, and then it put U.S. national security at risk. It put human sources of the U.S. intelligence community at risk and intelligence capabilities. And the documents came from all the top agencies of the U.S. intelligence community, the CIA, the NSA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. And again, he showed them to people. And this document, this indictment, contains 2 devastatingly incriminating recordings, which you don't often see in cases like this. One of Donald Trump talking about his knowledge of that he had classified material after his presidency, and a second one, which we know from reporting, was his lawyer, Evan Corcoran, essentially memorializing all his interactions with Donald Trump. That you almost never see. They pierce the crime fraud privilege there. So this is a powerful case and a really troubling moment for the country and for the legal system.
Ken Delaney, and thank you so much for putting some of that in context in terms of why this intelligence matters, and in the previous cases that you've covered, how this actually compares to those cases where people didn't even show potential documents that were classified to others and yet had significant prison terms. I want to bring in Kelly O'Donnell now, who is standing by for us. So Kelly O, let's talk politics, shall we? Look, you just had Mike Pence speaking at an impromptu press conference just minutes before this was unsealed in front of us. And he said he thought he was gravely concerned about it, but he also thought that it sent the wrong message to file these federal charges against the former president. What does this mean for all of his opponents now who've jumped in and want to run and secure the GOP nomination and eventually the White House? How might they use this now against former President Donald Trump, far and away the front runner?
One of the thorniest things for other candidates in the Republican field is there has been a narrative in Republican politics for a period of time now, years, of the former president, allies of his, others in the party, attacking the institutions of the Department of Justice, the FBI, and so forth. And the former president using that politically as a way to sort of cover the landscape politically with claims of things being a hoax, being a witch hunt, all that terminology we've been bombarded with over the last few years. Then you have other candidates who know that Trump voters, who are very sought after in the Republican nominating field, have been exposed to that. Many of them believe it, separate from the facts here. And so one of the challenges for the candidates will be to look at the specifics laid out in this indictment, and does that change their view when they raise questions about, has the Department of Justice, have the levers of power in institutions been dealt fairly at conservatives as well as on the liberal side? For example, many believe that Hillary Clinton, when she was involved with her own situation, she was not charged. But in this case, we see an indictment here. Now, the facts are different and so forth, but I'm talking about the political atmosphere. So that will be a challenge for candidates. We've seen Asa Hutchinson, former governor of Arkansas, who has said this is disqualifying for a candidate. We've seen Mike Pence express concern about the divisiveness of this for the country. The real question politically will be, do the facts and the specifics as they're laid out here, the evidence, if you will, does that change minds? Now, I'm here at the White House, and the current president is on the road today in North Carolina. And in talking with top officials here, you know, the general view is they do not want to engage on the matter of the Trump indictment and the political and legal peril of the person that they likely expect could be a rival in this next election. The president was asked today on the road by the pool traveling with him about this. He said he does not want to comment on the indictment at all, and then also was asked about an interaction with his attorney general, Merrick Garland, who, of course, separated himself from this by having a special counsel, Jack Smith, who does not report directly to him. And the president is saying he has not spoken to Merrick Garland about this at all. So the White House takes the position that they are in a separate silo and that this is not something that they want to be engaged in. In a political sense, certainly the Biden White House knows how to run against Donald Trump, and that could be the best candidate for a general election from the perspective of Biden as a candidate. In listening to the conversation here, having covered the Trump White House and so forth, one thing I want to say is the Walt not a character in this. 20 years in the U.S. Navy, worked in the Navy mess here at the White House, was promoted to this role as a valet, having this deep personal interaction with then President Trump in all of his daily interactions, and then is offered the chance to leave the Navy and move to Mar-a-Lago and to work alongside the president, which put him in this position. So the power differential between a former president and this trusted staffer is very significant, and you certainly see that playing out in the details of the narrative within this indictment.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that for us, Kelly. Let me play a little bit of what we heard from Vice President Mike Pence, former Vice President Mike Pence, earlier, so we can talk a little more about it after.
No one is above the law. And in America, we have to stand on the rule of law, irrespective of politics. Secondly, the handling of classified materials is a very serious matter in this nation.
Okay, so Kelly, stay with us. Let's also bring in Danny Savalos, who has been running all around trying to gather thoughts, information here, listening to the former vice president. We heard him at different times kind of try to thread a needle, but there has been this narrative that started a couple of days ago from Trump allies of trying to kind of tie his situation of mishandling classified documents to the ongoing investigation into Pence, which his investigation has now wrapped, and I think more prominently now, the investigation into President Biden's mishandling of classified documents, which is ongoing. He has not been interviewed yet, and that is from his time as vice president. Is that argument going to work, or are these completely different cases?
Expect a motion from the defense as to arguing selective prosecution. In other words, saying that the prosecution here has abused its discretion by prosecuting me, Trump, and not these other people that did these similar things. It's a legal form of whataboutism, but it almost never succeeds. I am not aware of any time where a motion for selective prosecution actually wins. As a defense attorney, you put it in, you try your best, you roll the dice, you see what you can make stick, and maybe an appeals court will take a second look. But that's always a long shot. Prosecutors, by their very definition, by their nature, have discretion. They choose the cases they bring and the cases that they don't want to bring, not the defendant. The defendant does not control that narrative. But in our, just initially reviewing this indictment, there are a lot of surprises, still not through everything. But in my mind, and I believe it was Kelly just pointing that out, all eyes are on Waltine Nauta, the alleged co-conspirator of President Trump. This is the kind of person that the government might be interested in getting to plead early and maybe become the government's friend going forward.
The star witness, so to speak.
Could be.
Let me ask you this while we still have you, Danny. Take a big picture step back here. We've been talking about when will these charges come out? What is the special, the grand jury talking about? It's all so super secret. But at the end of the day, now we've got 49 pages in front of us that really help us understand exactly the kind of questions they were asking, the witnesses they were talking to, and the evidence they were able to gather. What are your big picture takeaways for the general public at home, the voting public, to take away from this in this moment?
There are a lot of details. It is worth reading. Indictments do not need to have this much factual allegations. In fact, this entire indictment could have been accomplished maybe in 10 pages. What you see here is what we call a speaking indictment. The government is sending a message to the public. They're showing their work. They're using this as a combination press release, and they know that their work will be scrutinized, so they are using this as a kind of press release, their way of explaining all the work they've been doing these past months and everything they believe they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt when they get to trial. So that extra information, photographs, you see these more and more in indictments. They really bring it home. It reads more like a magazine than the typical stilted language of a classic indictment, which again is usually accomplished, at least in the old days, with a normal case. It can be done in just, a dozen pages, maybe less.
All right. Danny Savalas.
I am not Kendall.
Thank you. You are not.
You're definitely
You're
Danny
just
Savalas.
as good. Danny Savalas, thank you so much. We're going to go back to the White House and talk a little more with Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly, pick up a little on what we were hearing from Danny. You started touching on it, the dynamics, the power dynamics between the co-defendants here, a former president, a former Navy veteran who then worked as a valet at the White House, then turned personal aide. What do you expect to happen there?
Well, in covering the White House, and this is my fourth administration, you do get a chance over time to really get to know some of those staffers who are not a part of the political process directly, or maybe in entry-level jobs. Some of the people who moved on from President Trump to his home in Mar-a-Lago and his post-presidential office. One was the junior staffer in the press shop, someone we interacted with all the time, Margot Martin. Another was Molly Michael, his executive assistant, the person who was sort of the gatekeeper at the Oval Office door. And if the president wanted to speak to you, or if calls were coming in, people called Molly. These are people who, when we're covering the White House, we have some sense of getting to know them. The military aides who work here not only guard the door of the West Wing, but there is a whole structure where the food service at the White House is conducted by the Navy mess. It's the cafeteria. Some of the personal needs of the family are done by people who are in the military. Others are a butler and executive office residence team that work in the private quarters for the family. But when you're looking at Walt Nauta, here's someone he's from Guam. He served in the Navy as an enlisted man who became a senior chief, a very high rank, a great accomplishment for him. And then because of that personal bond with President Trump, someone who could be trusted to be in the Oval Office, at the door of the Oval Office, at the residence, handling private and personal things for the president, that creates a certain closeness and intimacy of daily life. And the former president wanted to have some of that with him in his post-presidential life. All presidents have an office that continues in part paid for by taxpayers. It's my understanding that Walt Nauta was paid in part by that budget for former presidents, and also part of the political PAC and the campaign structure of Trump world. So given, if you will, a promotion to go travel with the president and work with him there. So when you read the document here and you see, we all know in our own lives when we're texting with people that we work closely with, the casual nature of that, the intimate details, the specifics, that a lot of that is spelled out in this because they had access to his phone, his text messages, and those of others with whom he interacted. Talking about moving the boxes to these locations here at Mar-a-Lago and so forth, not in the official place of the storage room that was so much a focus of our attention when we first learned about the execution of the search at Mar-a-Lago about 10 months ago. But, you know, in a bathroom, they reference the names internally of the private quarters of the former First Family at Mar-a-Lago. So it does have that movie script narrative feeling when it's being written. And in this case, you've got a former president who is then putting this Navy man in a position of what now, based on this, is violating the law. And then he had that opportunity, based on the document here, to speak with the FBI in a voluntary interview. And it is their assessment that things he said to the investigators were in contrast to the body of evidence, that narrative I was just referencing of text messages and emails and photos that now makes Walt Nauta a co-conspirator in this indictment. So it gives you a reminder, as I have worked in White Houses over time, there are sometimes characters who become bigger in the drama who we knew in a much different role in their day-to-day life as public servants. And in this case, again, that power imbalance between a former president who has been the dominant force in the Republican Party since he left office, of course, and someone who was in many ways a very private, personal aide type figure, not a politically savvy person from his campaign. So that's part of what I find interesting in the human side of how this indictment is unfolding.
Yeah, that is really interesting, Kelly O. Thank you for your insight, because you're right. When you have those relationships, those text messages, and kind of that loyalty, frankly, of working for a former president, it will be interesting to see, as Danny Savalas just said, whether or not that person then gets flipped by the prosecution and becomes a star witness. I want to draw on your deep political knowledge and White House knowledge here, Kelly. There's a part of this indictment, page 21, where they're talking about Trump Attorney 1's testimony and saying, you know what? He said that he did it, that it was him, that he was the one who deleted all of her emails, the 30,000 emails, because they basically dealt with her scheduling and her going to the gym and her having beauty appointments. And he was great. And so she didn't get in any trouble because he said that he was the one who deleted them. Does that read to you as though he's talking about Hillary Clinton?
I think that might be a reference to the legal team for Hillary Clinton. Yeah. Because I believe when they provided information to the Justice Department at that time, you've heard former President Trump talk about the bleaching of the hard drive and things like that. One of the challenges of an indictment is it doesn't always identify who the specific figures are or who is represented by various pronouns in this. But clearly, the president has always been, former president has always been fixated on the circumstances around Hillary Clinton's handling of classified information, the private server, which I was referencing, offices of former presidents, that was set up in the Clinton home as a part of the office of former President Bill Clinton, and she participated using that server. And so the treatment of these two cases, the facts are dramatically different. But in the political narrative, you have a lot of conservatives who feel that Hillary Clinton was not prosecuted, and therefore a Trump figure should not be prosecuted. That is an intense debate, and the facts, of course, are crucially important in how that lays out. But what is interesting in this about the consciousness of the mind of former President Trump, his specific actions, the directions that he did in terms of telling people what to do, including his own lawyers, that the indictment finds violated the law.
All right, Kelly O'Donnell at the White House for us. Thank you so much, Kelly O, for taking us through and giving us some really valuable insider insight there.
We have Ron Allen with us. He is in Florida. Ron, viewers have probably noticed, as we are also keeping an eye on the corner of our screen, that empty podium. That is where we expect special counsel Jack Smith to speak in the next 8 minutes or so. We are not expecting him to take any sort of questions, but do you have any indication or any sense of what he might discuss at this press conference?
Not specifically, no, but obviously there is so much in this indictment. He's not going to go through the detail of it, but there's so much to digest that you can imagine there are many things that he could talk about. Probably a pretty terse statement justifying going forward with this case, because there's still going to be obviously a lot of criticism, a lot of pushback from President Trump, former President Trump, and his supporters, saying that this is weaponization, that this is not justified, and so forth. As I was reading through it, I'm curious. Question comes to my mind is, why did he do all of this? Was it just hubris? Was it just writing a memoir? It's hard to understand why he would be so possessive of all this information. Is it power to have this at some point in your post-presidency? And there are indications in the indictment that he was showing off, disseminating, the technical word, some of this information to people who shouldn't have been seeing it. So there's that question of why. Here in Florida, we're getting ready for a big day on Tuesday. Suddenly, Miami is on the map. Remember, as of this time last week or so, the expectation was that all this was happening in Washington and that there was not really a Florida component to all this. So now we are going to see what the security arrangements are like. We're looking around to see if there are going to be protesters on either side, both sides, as has been the case, as was the case in New York, and a lot of concern about security here in Miami going forward.
Mm-hmm. All right, Ron Allen in Miami, where the former president, is expected to be arraigned this coming Tuesday. And just a recap for you right now, we are learning more about exactly what is in the indictment, the first ever of a former president. We're about to go to a special report now. Lester Holt joins us with an NBC News special report.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day and welcome. We're coming on the air with breaking news. The special counsel whose probe led to the first federal criminal charges ever filed against a former president is set to speak any moment now. This will be the first time we've heard from special counsel Jack Smith since he was appointed to lead the investigation. His statement comes after the indictment of Donald Trump was unsealed this afternoon. It detailed 37 counts of breaking 7 different laws, all related to his handling of classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago home. Those charges include 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information. The Justice Department just released these new photos of those documents, and the indictment says they came from all of the top national security and law enforcement agencies, including the CIA, the Pentagon, and the NSA. The indictment also says he showed classified documents to others twice in 2021. And as a reminder, Mr. Trump has denied any wrongdoing. I want to go to our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett, and NBC News legal analyst, Danny Savalos. Laura, first to you. It seems like they are building a narrative of what happened, but also trying to make the point that Mr. Trump knew what he was doing was unauthorized.
This document serves as a rebuttal to a lot of the defenses that we've heard put out there by the former president, by his attorneys, by his allies. And this document actually has some meat on the bones, things that we've never heard before, talking about his personal involvement in how these boxes actually got down to Mar-a-Lago. We've talked about potential defenses a lot. One of his best defenses would have been if he had been able to say, I don't know anything about how they got down there. Once they got down there, I had nothing to do with it. This takes this head on to say he was receiving pictures of the documents. He's getting all kinds of communications from his body man and other employees about where they are at all times. Are they in the bathroom? Are they in the shower? Are they in that grand ballroom we just saw a picture of? He is intimately involved in the transportation and whereabouts of these boxes over a period of months.
Danny, I'm not a lawyer, but going through it, I see points where it appears the prosecution is anticipating some of the lines of defense and cutting them off.
Absolutely, and a lot of these relate to inadvertence. In other words, we've known for a long time that documents went from D.C. down to Mar-a-Lago, and they stayed there. But the real challenge for the government was always showing evidence of intent. And by showing all of these interactions with Trump and maybe people below him, his alleged co-conspirator, the government pieces together what they think makes the case for intent. knowledge that he retained the documents and intent to either keep them, not turn them back over. Keep in mind that many of these elements of these different crimes overlap. There are parts of concealment of documents that are really very similar to parts of intentional retention of the documents. There are parts of document destruction that are similar to other counts or other elements of other crimes. So here you have a lot of overlapping elements of crimes that the government really focuses on intent. Just like Laura said, they know that Trump's, one of his chief defenses is going to be my underlings, the people below me. I have a team. They handle this. They swept these documents into boxes. I was a hands-off kind of guy. I thought most of it was mine, or I just didn't know any better. That's what this indictment, in my mind, sets out to do, to defeat that out of the gate, the idea that Trump simply knew nothing, saw nothing, and heard no evil. The other thing that jumps out at me is that all eyes now are on Waltine Nauta, Trump's alleged co-conspirator in this case. This, to me, strikes me as the ideal person that the government would be interested in discussing a plea agreement with and possibly bringing Waltine Nauta over to their side as a possible cooperating witness. This is almost a textbook idea in the government's mind of someone who could be incredibly helpful, someone who knows the target very well, and someone who may know more even than the government already knows, which is saying a lot because this indictment indicates the government knows quite a bit.
But it's worth noting they tried. They tried to flip him months ago and failed. According to our reporting, they brought his attorney into a meeting at the Justice Department last winter and tried to have that discussion, confronting the attorney, essentially saying, we think he wasn't straightforward with us, but the attorney didn't show any interest in cooperating.
The prosecution now laying its cards on the table, indicating what it has or thinks it has. I want to bring in former U.S. Attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, an NBC News contributor also, and we're waiting. You see on the other side of the screen, the podium where Jack Smith will be speaking here shortly. And toward that end, let me ask you, Chuck, he's not obligated to make a statement. He's been quiet publicly during this entire process. What would you expect to be the pressures on him, if at all, to come out and make a statement on the back of this release today?
Well, first, Lester, appropriately quiet during the pendency of the investigation, just as Mr. Mueller was. It's not okay for prosecutors to speak publicly about investigations, with very limited exceptions not applicable here. Second, now that there is an unsealed indictment, here's what you should expect. Relatively constrained, relatively little, no embellishments. When I gave these types of press conferences as a United States attorney, I was required to stick to what we call the four corners of the document. He will describe who has been charged and what they have been charged with. But you're not going to get any color, any flourishes, or any embellishments. You're going to get basically stuff, Lester, that you can read and have read in the indictment that's just been unsealed. That's the duty of a prosecutor. Because the grand jury has returned its indictment, because the indictment is now in the public record, in the public domain, it's okay to speak about it. But he won't go further. And if he has something more to say, he'll say it in court.
Well, talk to me about the whole idea of a special counsel. Does the DOJ have any involvement right now in this case, or is it strictly Mr. Smith's office?
Well, so far it seems to be strictly Mr. Smith's office. The Attorney General of the United States has ultimate authority for all aspects of the Department of Justice, including a special counsel, meaning that if Mr. Garland had wanted to intervene because he thought something was off the rails or improper, he could have done so. For all we know, Lester, that has not happened, that Mr. Garland has given Jack Smith free rein to run this case as he sees fit. That was essentially the design of the special counsel regulations. It replaced the independent counsel statute. Folks will remember that Ken Starr, an independent counsel, some thought he went too far, strayed from the main thrust of his investigation. And so the special counsel regulations were designed to rein that in a bit. Bob Mueller was a special counsel. John Durham was a special counsel. And now Jack Smith is a special counsel. And Merrick Garland has kept his hands off of the investigation. I think that's the appropriate thing here. He is ultimately responsible for the operation of the entire Department of Justice, but did not seem to interfere in Mr. Smith's investigation.
All right, Chuck, if you'll stand by it again, remind folks on the other side of the screen from me, you're looking at the podium where Jack Smith will be speaking, making a statement, not taking any questions, we're told, and he may be running a little late, but you can see them making the adjustments to the flags and whatnot. Let's go right to our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson, right now. Hallie, I guess the question is what's going to be controlling the narrative today? Obviously, this unsealed document speaks loudly. We're going to hear from the special counsel. What are we hearing from the former president, if anything?
Well, he, since the indictment has dropped, Lester, is going after the person we're about to see step to that microphone there, and that is special counsel Jack Smith. That is not new for Donald Trump. He has been attacking the people investigating him now for months. But obviously, this takes on a different dimension since this indictment has been unsealed, since the charges have come out, calling, and I'm only going to quote a short bit here, but calling Smith, among other things, a deranged psycho and a Trump hater. Again, no evidence to support that Jack Smith is a Trump hater, as we've talked about previously in Donald Trump's attacks on Mr. Smith. That said, Lester, this is the Donald Trump playbook. He is already fundraising off of these federal charges. He already has a merch out about these federal charges. Much of this, as I'm keeping an eye just a bit on the microphone here,
this is the 2-minute warning we're getting right now.
Yep, speaks to the sort of mindset that Donald Trump had after his first indictment. Different charges, different levels, state, not federal, but in the way that the campaign tried to politically use this to their advantage. The question is, given the extraordinary revelations in this indictment, Lester, that you have been talking through there in New York, does the political center hold outside of Donald Trump? His team, by all accounts, is already, and if past precedent is any indication, digging in defiantly here that Donald Trump did nothing wrong and that this is merely the former president being victimized by an overly partisan Department of Justice. That's their perspective. Will those in the broader Republican orbit agree, given the revelations that we're seeing here? I'm talking about not just the former president's competitors in the Republican primary, but key members of, I'm thinking, Senate leadership, et cetera, who have a stake in the national security apparatus of the United States, Lester.
All right, Hallie Jackson, and you saw some activity at the podium. That was one of the assistants or aides letting us know that we will see the special counsel in about 2 minutes, and that was about a minute ago. So we'll continue to keep an eye on this picture. Laura, let me just go to you very quickly. Again, Jack Smith, not widely known among people. What do we know about him?
A career federal prosecutor, highly experienced war crimes prosecutor, someone who has a reputation for being quite aggressive and dogged. And here we see him walking in right there in the middle.
Good afternoon. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with felony violations of our national security laws, as well as participating in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. This indictment was voted by a grand jury of citizens in the Southern District of Florida, and I invite everyone to read it in full to understand the scope and the gravity of the crimes charged. The men and women of the United States intelligence community and our armed forces dedicate their lives to protecting our nation and its people. Our laws that protect national defense information are critical to the safety and security of the United States, and they must be enforced. Violations of those laws put our country at risk. Adherence to the rule of law is a bedrock principle of the Department of Justice, and our nation's commitment to the rule of law sets an example for the world. We have one set of laws in this country, and they apply to everyone. Applying those laws, collecting facts, that's what determines the outcome of an investigation. Nothing more and nothing less. The prosecutors in my office are among the most talented and experienced in the Department of Justice. They have investigated this case hewing to the highest ethical standards, and they will continue to do so as this case proceeds. It's very important for me to note that the defendants in this case must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. To that end, my office will seek a speedy trial in this matter, consistent with the public interest and the rights of the accused. We very much look forward to presenting our case to a jury of citizens in the Southern District of Florida. In conclusion, I would like to thank the dedicated public servants of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with whom my office is conducting this investigation and who work tirelessly every day upholding the rule of law in our country. I'm deeply proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. Thank you very much.
Why Florida, sir? Why did you decide to bring the case in Florida?
Jack Smith taking no questions. We were told ahead of time that he wouldn't, but making about a 2.5-minute statement there, defending the integrity of his team and those who've worked on this case, saying that strongly defending his team, saying there is one set of laws and they apply to everyone, referring to the former president, and inviting people to read the document in full, and saying that violation of security laws puts our country at risk. Notably, he did not speak to the narrative or the evidence that's contained in today's release. Danny, let me start with you. Your reaction to what you just heard.
No surprises. Chuck Rosenberg said it. I think we all knew it. He was going to come out, and the textbook response here is, here's the indictment. Look at it. My work is done. Thank the men and women of the FBI who contributed, any other agencies that contributed, and move on. No questions, so no surprises from Jack Smith here. He did his speaking. His team did their speaking, and law enforcement all spoke through this multiple-page indictment, which lays out a lot of detail, far more detail than you need in a federal indictment. I mean, the fact that they would include photographs and all of the information that they did sends a message. And the message is, we believe we have the goods.
He knows his every word is being scrutinized, his every movement. This is the first time we have ever heard him speak since he was appointed last year. And it's interesting to me to note just his affect, his disposition. It's solemn. He wanted everyone to understand the scope and the gravity of what's at stake here, emphasizing that this is about what's critical for the safety and security for the United States.
Think this is the last we'll hear of him until trial?
I bet so. Yeah, I think that he wanted to get something out, obviously, right now, because there is going to be this delay until the indictment is, actually presented for his arraignment on Tuesday. And there's a lot of time to fill. And I think he felt the need to actually stand up there and represent the department in that time.
All right, well, let me bring back former U.S. Attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, he talked about his office will seek a speedy trial. We hear that term all the time, speedy trial. What does that look like in practicality?
Sure. Great question. So there are references to speedy trial both in the statutes of the United States and in the Constitution of the United States. And both sides, a defendant and the government, are entitled to a speedy trial. A government's case never gets better with age. Danny is a very good defense attorney, and he would tell you that the more time he has as a defense attorney, the more the advantage slightly begins to shift in his direction. The government would tell you the opposite. They have done their investigation. They have dotted their I's. They have crossed their T's. I should add, by the way, Lester, every word in that indictment was fly-spec. No word goes into that indictment unless the government has a document, an email, a text message, a witness who can attest to the veracity of those words. But over time, if you don't get a speedy trial, memories fade, witnesses may become reluctant to testify. Other bad things can happen to degrade a government's case. So Jack Smith wants a speedy trial. He's ready. The indictment demonstrates that. Mr. Trump may have a different motive. It will be up to the judge to decide when this case is tried, and hopefully we'll keep it on a good track to trial.
Well, the former president, certainly has the right, I'm sure you'd agree, to take all legal options that he has, but he also has a reputation for getting a way to kick the can down the road and lengthen out the process. Are there many avenues like that afforded to him in a federal prosecution such as this?
That's a great question, because most of his can kicking down the road, Lester, occurred in civil trials. and in state court. And having practiced as a federal prosecutor as a criminal prosecutor in federal court, I can tell you that it is a very different environment. The federal judges in front of whom I appeared ran very tight courtrooms, adhered strictly to the schedules they set. There wasn't a lot of opportunity to kick cans down the road. Now, look, a case will also be delayed on occasion because of its complexities, and on occasion because of its motions, and possibly because there's a interlocutory or interim appeal to an appellate court challenging a judge's ruling. All of those things can introduce delay. But by and large, criminal cases in federal court move with a degree of alacrity that you simply don't find in civil cases and that you often don't find in state courts.
Chuck Rosenberg, always appreciate your analysis. Thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. We're going to hand off our coverage to my colleagues, Ellison Barber and Vicki Nguyen, right now.
Welcome to NBC News Daily. I'm Vicki Nguyen.
And I'm Ellison Barber. We continue to follow breaking news and the unprecedented legal peril facing former President Donald Trump. He is now the first president in American history to be indicted on federal criminal charges. Details of the indictment were just released and include 7 charges and 37 total counts. Stay with us because there are a lot of them and we will break them down. So 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information, and then 1 count of each of the following: false statements and representations, conspiracy to obstruct justice, withholding a document or record, corruptly concealing a document or record, concealing a document in a federal investigation, and scheme to conceal.
The case involves Trump's handling of classified documents after he left office. For months, Mr. Trump refused to return the documents despite multiple requests. That led to a raid of his Mar-a-Lago estate back in August. Now you're looking at these newly released photos. They allege Trump stored boxes with classified documents all over the place in Mar-a-Lago, frankly. The ballroom, his bedroom, even a bathroom and a shower. Special counsel Jack Smith, who has been virtually silent throughout this investigation, he just spoke and addressed the charges.
We have one set of laws in this country, and they apply to everyone.
All right, we want to bring in our Homeland Security correspondent, Julia Ainsley, who's been standing by. She was actually just in the room. Special counsel Jack Smith spoke for about 2 minutes. Julia, he didn't take any questions, but he was grave, he was solemn, and he said, look, bottom line here, the former president is facing felony violations of national security laws, including conspiracy to obstruct justice. And he said, essentially, this does put lives in danger. Walk us through the highlights of what he just told the American public.
Well, you're right. It was short, and he is serious and grave. Former Special Counsel Jack Smith was a former war crimes prosecutor in The Hague. He doesn't want a lot of fanfare around this. He was very careful and specific to say, look, these are charges, but right now these men, Trump and Walter Natta, are presumed innocent until proven guilty. He wants to keep really as much of a distance as he can between that and himself and the former president who was out there making these claims. He wants to show this is serious and apolitical. And it's one of the reasons why the grand jury is in southern Florida. It was a surprise that came to a lot of us that the grand jury had moved from Washington to Florida. It was actually a question that was shouted to Jack Smith just at the end of the press conference. He took no questions. He wants to keep this as dry as possible, but he laid out everything he has really in this indictment, and he put it out very publicly today. I also wanted to call attention just to how he describes a lot of those documents. Jack Smith is in a tough space because he can't be too specific about this information because, of course, the heart of this matter is on those classified documents and how the former president may have posed a national security risk by disclosing that information. But he wants the American public and, of course, eventually a jury to be able to see exactly what it was that was disclosed and in the possession of the former president. He talks about a 2019 December document that concerned a foreign country supporting terrorist acts. He talks about a March 2020 military operation against the United States, the plans for those things, documents that he had in his possession that were incredibly highly sensitive, some of them having to do with the nuclear arms and nuclear capabilities of the United States, the kind of things that Donald Trump himself would have been incredibly critical of anyone else having in their possessions. And they do also call into question Donald Trump's, as a candidate, his own criticism of then Hillary Clinton and the information she had in her email. But this is all coming from a tried and true prosecutor who wants no fanfare, no distractions from the charges he's bringing today, very robust charges that could carry a maximum of 20 years in prison for the former president.
And Julia, the special counsel did not take any questions after this, which was announced prior to him taking the podium. But one thing that stood out to me in his remarks was that he repeatedly touched on the integrity of the people working on this case, referring to some of them at one point as dedicated public servants. We have heard a lot from Donald Trump criticizing the DOJ, the FBI. It seemed to me, and I'm interested how you took it, that Special Counsel Jack Smith was trying to address some of those criticisms without directly taking it head on. Were you surprised at the numerous references to the integrity and the character of the people at the DOJ and the FBI in that very short statement?
Not surprised at all, and I think the way you characterized it is perfect. You have to look at what Jack Smith has ahead of him. He's heading into a trial. We know on Tuesday we'll see the former president be arraigned in Florida. And just by the mere fact that Donald Trump already told all of his followers on Truth Social where and when he will be arraigned, that could be a calling for protesters to come out. He wants to make sure that the people, his investigators, and anyone else involved in this case are protected from a security perspective, first and foremost, their physical security, but also from a reputational perspective. He doesn't want his investigation or the Justice Department as a whole to be tainted or their credibility tainted through this case as the former president tries to make it more and more of a political wedge issue. He knows that he's bringing this not just against a former president, but as a front runner for the Republican nomination going into 2024. The stakes are high. Jack Smith is familiar and used to having high stakes, but I think this is definitely the most high-profile case of his career. It's unprecedented in American history. It is imperative today that Jack Smith puts a big buffer around his team and around the work they've done here to show that it was thorough and credible. And it's also a reason we're even here today, why we're having this press conference, why this indictment was unsealed before the arraignment, because Donald Trump himself was controlling the narrative before the Justice Department could show the American people the amount of evidence that they collected here, exactly how personally involved the former president was in each decision on the movement of these boxes, on how they labeled and retained and stored and moved these documents. He needed to show the American people that. They couldn't wait till Tuesday because in the meantime, you're just hearing more and more and more from Trump. This was Jack Smith's way to get out the information in a clear way, letting the documents and the evidence speak for itself and to be able to show that he stands behind his team going into what's ahead.
Julia Ainsley, thank you so much. Stand by. To Julia's point, I want to bring in our legal analyst, NBC News legal analyst, Charles Coleman now, who's standing by with us. Thank you for being here. All right. So a lot of folks don't have legal training and legal expertise. We've got 49 pages that read in fairly plain spoken English. But what do you want people to take away from this? I mean, you heard Special Counsel Jack White saying people should read this in its entirety. But let's say they don't have time. They're busy making dinner, running their lives. What should they take away from this unsealing?
So, Vicki, we've got to step back first and understand that Jack Smith has given a master class to the American people about what prosecutors actually do. In most cases, we do not have the level of insight that Jack Smith and the entire investigation that we've seen into most of the time what prosecutors do in terms of their cases. In this case, obviously, it's different for a number of different reasons. There's been a ton of very, very stellar investigative reporting that has given the American public insight at different turns. But Jack Smith has been quiet and up until today said nothing. He's let this indictment speak for himself. He's let the charges speak for themselves. And I think that that's important to understand. That's what prosecutors do. They are methodical. His decision to move this case to Florida when he could have put it in D.C., again, those are all strategic choices that a prosecutor makes in terms of understanding what it is that he needs to do and how he's going to play this by the book. There are so many different elements as to how this case could have gone were Jack Smith not the type of prosecutor who he is. So I have to emphasize that point because people might miss it. Now, when you're getting to the substance of the indictment, it's important to understand, we'll take a quick 10-second trip to law school, okay? In order to prove a crime like this, you have two elements. You have the crime itself, and then you have the intent. So the act and the intent. Donald Trump and his defense team are not going to be able to deny the act itself. The documents were there. The pictures are there. We know that the documents were there. That's not in dispute. So now the only thing that they can do is try to attack the intent. So with that, what you see with this indictment is a very careful and masterful and meticulous weaving together of a story. And the story itself is what attacks the intent. And that is what Jack Smith has to do as a prosecutor in order to satisfy his burden of proving this case beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not a question of whether the documents were there. It's not a question of whether it was legal for Donald Trump to have the documents. The only defense that they would have would be his intention, which is why, if you recall, his attorneys tried to meet with the DOJ earlier in the week. Right. And one of the things that they were arguing was this should be treated as an administrative matter, not as a criminal matter. That's all about intent. He didn't mean to do this, and so it should not be criminal. The story that Jack Smith has woven together with this indictment really does chip away at that narrative and eliminate the question of intent on Donald Trump's part. And that's what a prosecutor does. So when I look at this indictment, when I think about everything that's been put on the table, I am, as a former prosecutor, quite frankly, proud, not necessarily from a guilt or innocence standpoint, but just because this clearly illustrates what prosecutors actually do in real life.
Okay. When you look at these documents, and former President Donald Trump has denied any wrongdoing here, but you see kind of the layers of where they're getting at this idea of intent, right? And I'm curious, from your legal background, what do you think is the stronger legal argument in these documents when it gets to that issue of intent? Is it where they're pointing out these examples of saying, here's where he was directing people to move these boxes? Here's what Hallie Jackson has now deemed the plucking incident, the anecdote of where he appeared to be saying, remove something out of there? Or is it these two instances from 2021, one of which has been very well documented, reported on, that is an audio recording of him saying, this is classified, this is secret, I should have made it not classified when I was in office, and I didn't do that. If you are looking at this from a legal standpoint, what has more legal water?
I think that it's the timeline, Ellison. I think it's the timeline, because the timeline is what tells the story. Each and every one of those discrete things, for me as a former prosecutor, is enough to make the case you knew what you were doing. You went and you have this recording that talks about the fact that you had this document and you wanted to use it, and you didn't really want to, you didn't know whether you could because it had issues with Iran and all of that, and you didn't want to put it out in the public, but you knew you should not have had it. In addition to that, as it lays out, as the indictment lays out, you had several warnings from different agencies that these documents were being sought. First, you were contacted by the National Archives. Then after that, you're contacted by the FBI. And then after that, you talk to your attorney and you essentially ask your attorney, well, do I have to give this stuff back? And your attorney tells you yes. So there are so many different pieces that have been woven together to illustrate very, very clearly a streamlined story that chips away at this notion of intent. So it's not any one thing for me. It's the overarching timeline and where Jack Smith has put each and every discrete instance, where if someone were to say, for example, well, maybe he did not know that he had these documents, you can't deny that. Maybe he didn't know he should have had these documents, you can't deny that. Maybe he didn't know that it was illegal, you can't deny that. So every sort of excuse that you could come up with, any sort of answer that you would be able to provide to say, look, he didn't mean to do this, Jack Smith has taken away with this indictment, and I suspect as he puts evidence in front of a jury, he will take it away from them as well.
Well, it stands to reason, once again, we should remind the audience the former president has said and denied all wrongdoing here and calling it, this box's hoax at this point. But as you point out, there is a case to be made. Jack Smith himself, the special counsel, says he wants a speedy trial in the Southern District of Florida. What does that mean, in terms of like a timeline? How does this play out from here for both, the public and the accused?
I'm so glad you asked about that, because one of the things that has gotten overlooked has been Jack Smith's decision to take this case and put it in Florida. There are a couple of advantages to that and a couple of disadvantages. From an advantageous place, we already know, because we've heard it before, that Donald Trump's defense, in part, is that the DOJ has been weaponized, that this is political and a political prosecution. Well, it's very hard to make that argument when you've taken a case that you could have put in a very liberal jurisdiction like Washington, D.C., and now you put it in your backyard in a red state, in a firmly conservative state in terms of Florida, a state that you, as a presidential candidate, carried twice.
And that grand jury also was made up of the citizens of the Southern District of Florida, as Jack pointed out.
So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, Vicky, is Florida has what's called a rocket docket. And a rocket docket essentially means that it's an accelerated calendar. The judges are going to be very aggressive about trying to move this case within the actual 6 months of speedy trial. So there is a period that is basically designated for felony offenses that constitutes speedy trial that you are guaranteed as a by the Constitution.
Right.
It doesn't always play out that way because there are several delays, things that can happen, and that stops the clock, so to speak. As a former prosecutor, you know that you're up against this clock, but there are things that can stop that clock procedurally that will essentially not count against the speedy trial clock. In Florida, they're going to accelerate that as much as they can. So I expect to see a trial date set within this first 90 days to 6 months. Okay. And while there will be motions, while there will be arguments and hearings to try to delay that for several reasons, Donald Trump is entitled to that. His defense team is going to, as they should, put forth every viable defense and try as many legal maneuvers as they can to get their client a viable defense. I still think that with that, the judges are going to be very aggressive. They're already mindful. Look, we know his legal strategy, delay, delay, delay. We've seen this before. So they're not going to necessarily go for that as much as they may have in the past. And the fact that it's a rocket docket and they move things very, very aggressively, I think we are looking at potentially the start of a trial early next year.
Okay, 90 days to 6 months, you're saying.
Yeah.
Let's head to Florida, where our colleague Ron Allen is on the ground. Ron, as we're talking about this timeline and when things could happen, there is a day that the former president has specifically told people about his supporters, Tuesday in South Florida in court. Are you seeing any sort of indication or any preparations for some sort of reaction from supporters of his or critics?
Well, we expect there to be a lot of activity here at the courthouse over the weekend in preparation for this Tuesday. It is a big, wide area that is very open to the public, and there's some question about how the police will secure this area if, in fact, they feel need to do that. And I'm sure they will to some extent. The question is to what extent. There have not been protests. There have not been big gatherings during the past months while this has all been going on. As a matter of fact, no one even knew, or very few people knew, that in fact the grand jury was meeting here. Everyone thought, the thinking was that this was happening in Washington, D.C. And we are about an hour and a half from Mar-a-Lago or so, and this area does not have a reputation for having large protests for or against former President Trump. That said, of course, we're into some new and unprecedented territory, so it remains to be seen exactly what will happen. We have been told that the court appearance will happen in this courthouse behind me, in one of the largest courtrooms there. He will be brought into the building. There are any number of entrances underground where they will do this secretly as best they can, I would expect. And they're obviously trying to avoid the kind of situation that happened in New York a couple months ago, when every movement by Mr. Trump from the time he landed at the airport, motorcading into Midtown to Trump Tower, and then the next morning down to later that morning down to the courthouse is chronicled and watched by helicopters and so forth. Whether that will happen here or not, of course, remains to be seen, but it will certainly be a big day. The expectation in the courtroom is that it will be a very quick, short proceeding, an arraignment. Whether he will enter a plea at that point is unclear. I imagine the judge will instruct him generally about what the charges are. And an interesting point, the judge, Alana Cannon, is the same judge who handled this case at the beginning some months ago and made a number of rulings that were very favorable to Mr. Trump, rulings that were later overturned in an appeals court, a judge who he appointed just a couple of years ago to the bench. Another interesting dynamic that will begin playing out here again on Tuesday.
Hey, Ron, so Donald J. Trump isn't the only name at the top of this indictment. There's another name here, Walt Nauta, his personal aide. We know he's a Navy veteran, that he went with Mr. Trump in 2021 to assist him at his personal residence in Mar-a-Lago. What else do we know about this valet, this personal aide, the body man, as they're calling him, from Guam? Is he also expected to be arraigned on Tuesday or at some point next week?
That's a good question. We haven't heard of a date for his first court appearance. And so at this point, I would think the expectation is no, that he will not be here on Tuesday. That may be at some point in the not too distant future. He is a very interesting figure in all this. Throughout the past number of months, there have been any number of media reports suggesting that he and other staffers there at Mar-a-Lago played an integral role in moving materials, concealing materials allegedly, and essentially doing former President Trump's bidding. This is an individual who's a Navy veteran who spent a lot of time at the White House. Mr. Trump has spoken glowingly of him. I've heard a number of legal analysts suggesting that he's a person that prosecutors may try to flip to try and get to testify against Mr. Trump. Based on what we know so far, you would think that this is an individual who has a lot of loyalty, although he is now suddenly today facing charges that could send him to prison for a significant amount of time. So that, of course, will perhaps enter into his thinking about what to do. But again, we expect to hear more about his role, alleged role in all of this. It's spelled out very clearly in the indictment. He was there at many steps along the way. He is the conspiracy, part of the conspiracy charge that Mr. Trump, and he orchestrated this, that he was doing Mr. Trump's bidding by moving boxes and concealing things and so forth. But of course, the big focus will be former President Trump when he arrives here and faces a judge for the second time in a number of months now. And what a moment that will be. I do not think that there will be cameras in the courtroom. There may be one of these situations where cameras are allowed to photograph and video the moments where the parties are assembling, but the actual proceedings may not be captured in that manner. But again, it remains to be seen. Such an unprecedented circumstance, and we will see how it plays out. And again, a lot of concerns here about security, about the logistics, about just how Tuesday will go, because certainly authorities want this to be as smooth as possible.
All right, Ron Allen, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
And we want to bring in Rahima Ellis, who is standing by for us. She's actually in New Jersey. Rahima, thank you. You know more about how Mr. Trump actually learned of the indictment, and you're also actually talking to folks in New Jersey. Bring us up to speed there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to take you back a little bit just to last night. According to reports that came in the New York Times, that President Trump's phone rang around 7 o'clock last night with a phone call from a member of his legal team telling him that he was going to be indicted. Then, according to the newspaper, at about 7:21 last night, the president posted on his social media account, this information, and also proclaiming that he was outraged by it, and in addition to that, proclaiming his innocence, insisting on his innocence of any of these charges. And less than an hour after learning that there was this indictment against him, the former president's campaign team released a fundraising email. This is sort of similar to what happened when he was indicted on charges by the Manhattan District Attorney in New York, and charges related to hush money being paid to an adult porn star. Following that, the Trump campaign team put out efforts to fundraise, and they did raise a considerable amount of money, some $12 million with that. What it all says here is that it seems as though the Trump team was well prepared for what was coming, and to launch a public relations effort in order to control the narrative and to continue to insist that their client was innocent of all charges and that these were trumped up against him. We went out and talked to some people here in the community. One gentleman said to us that he was just tired of hearing about all of this and he wished it would go away. Another woman insisted that everyone should be treated the same way, that former Vice President Pence and that President Biden should be treated. And if they're going to bring charges against President Trump, charges should also be brought against Pence and Biden. I mentioned to her that these charges against President Trump were about withholding information and documents. And at that point, She said, well, if he is guilty, if anybody is guilty of anything, they should all be held accountable.
Raheem, it's so interesting that you have been able to speak to people in that community, because looking through these documents, you're very quickly reminded on page 2 that 2 of the key incidents that are alleged to have been the moments when Donald Trump showed classified documents to people who he should not have been showing them to at any point happened there in New Jersey, in Bedminster. President Donald Trump, for viewers who may have forgotten, this was where he spent most of his summers while he was in office. He's very well known in that community. Do you expect, when you're speaking with people there, do you get the sense that they are maybe paying a little more attention to this than, say, Americans in other states with less of a direct Trump connection? Or do you think what you're hearing is reflective of what a lot of Americans are processing right now?
In my totally unscientific survey of a couple of people not too long ago, I have to tell you, the feeling I got was that this was a very sympathetic Trump community, or at least these couple of people that I spoke to were very much sympathetic to him, thinking that he has been victimized by all of this, thinking that people are coming after him unjustifiably. That's the kind of thing that the former president, I'm sure, is glad to hear and is counting on. And that's one of the reasons I suspect, while his team, as I said, was ready to launch last night a public relations campaign insisting on the former president's innocence. You know that he's going to be here overnight. Then he is going to travel this weekend to 2 GOP events, one in Columbus, Georgia, and the other one in Greensboro, North Carolina. It's expected that he will come back here at some point to Bedminster. And as you've been talking about, he's going to go on to Miami next week. And it's an interesting that's going to happen there that was pre-scheduled. While he is going to be in court on Tuesday morning to face these charges, on Tuesday evening, he's expected to have a fundraiser that was pre-scheduled. Also, he's scheduled to celebrate his birthday, which is on Wednesday, and he turns 77 years old.
Wow. All right. Raheem Ellis, thank you so much. Very busy schedule for the former president. We want to bring in Kelly O'Donnell, who's standing by at the White House now. Kelly O, bringing our viewers up to speed. The special counsel, Jack Smith, just talked about what was laid out in this 49-page indictment, that the former president is facing felony violations of national security laws, as well as conspiracy to obstruct justice, which speaks to intention. What's the reaction there from the White House, and also the accusations that the Department of Justice has been weaponized?
Well, this is politically quite fraught for the Biden administration, for the president, because he ran against Donald Trump and could likely run against him again, depending on if we get our crystal balls out and see what will happen with the GOP nomination process for 2024. President Biden has declared to run again. He doesn't have any challengers in his party. So this puts him in the position of having to deal with a predecessor and a current rival facing prosecution from the Department of Justice. That is a difficult place to be for the Biden White House. So what we have seen is they have tried to make it very clear that they are staying separate from this. The spokespeople here, the senior aides who are tasked with dealing with these issues, are saying they won't be making any comment about it. The president himself has been pressed on a couple of these points. Our own colleague Peter Alexander sort of created a moment yesterday at the end of a news conference where he was able to get the president's attention and ask what really turned out to be a prescient question, and one that delivered a response from President Biden that may in fact fill the gap for a very long time, asking him about the credibility of the Justice Department and how the American people who have doubts about that or questions about it, how he could assure them. And President Biden said that he has not told the Justice Department to take any action or not take any action, and that he would completely separate himself from that process. Separately, he has talked about the fact that he is not discussing this with his own Attorney General, Merrick Garland. And of course, there is some distance between Garland and Smith as a function of this political environment where Garland decided to appoint a special counsel in this case. So, having said all of that, they're trying to avoid talking about it. We do persistently ask when there are new updates like this, and a significant one of this indictment is certainly clears that bar. And don't expect much commentary about that. Today, traveling with the president, the reporters in the pool today as he is visiting North Carolina, he said he wouldn't comment on it. So that will be what you hear from this White House. At the same time, in just the political terms, taking it out of the governing role, certainly they would expect to be running against Donald Trump, and in many ways would want him to be the opponent they would draw for the general election because they have already done it once. They know him. They think things like this certainly are liabilities for the former president. Whatever the outcome is, it will be a difficult, contentious election period. We all know that. And so the unknowns that are injected into all of this, in some ways, are more difficult for the Biden campaign as well, because they sort of know the playbook for Donald Trump. So that's where we are with this. And certainly there'll be separate sort of universes unfolding as this president tries to govern, tries to do the job of being president, while the 2024 Republican field will certainly be talking about this and dealing with it. And the allegations will continue to be made about whether the current Justice Department is fair. And of course, President Biden has his own classified documents investigation that is still ongoing. Mike Pence was cleared. The Biden case is still ongoing.
Kelly O'Donnell at the White House, thank you for that. And Vicki, it is interesting because the Trump campaign, as we've heard from so many of our reporters, is already fundraising on this. I had an email this morning where he has a T-shirt related to it that is for sale. So in some ways, it seems like they see this as something that could be a political win down the road. Remains to be seen.
A fundraising opportunity, at least in the interim.
Right, yes. Let's head back to D.C. now. Julia Ainsley, our colleague, is there. She was inside the room when the special counsel, Jack Smith, made his remarks moments ago. Julia, we understand you have some new reporting speaking to folks in that area. What have you been hearing?
Well, yes, we were just inside where Jack Smith made short remarks, but really to try to make his case that these are serious crimes, that the people who worked for him did serious work that is apolitical, and that violations of the laws, like the laws that Trump violated, are serious and that they put the national security of the country at risk. In other words, there are no political motivations behind this. It had to be done. But he also still pointed out that the people charged here being Nader and Trump are innocent until proven guilty. He was clear to say that. And so he did make a comment, though, to say that the people he worked for are of utmost integrity. Here's what he had to say.
Nothing more and nothing less. The prosecutors in my office are among the most talented and experienced in the Department of Justice. They have investigated this case hewing to the highest ethical standards, and they will continue to do so as this case proceeds.
And I will say, just reading through this, I mean, a lot of us have been paying very close attention to what exactly happened with these documents, how they went to Mar-a-Lago, later to Bedminster, the coordination between his lawyers and the National Archives. That there was still a lot of information that was new to reporters today, especially because that grand jury process is secretive and this was sealed until just hours ago. But it is a very thorough case as they lay out more than 30 counts of how the president very personally got involved in trying to keep certain documents with him. There was one set of documents known as the Beautiful Mind papers that he wanted to take wherever he went. His aides were very aware of exactly what he was referring to, how they should be labeled. His lawyers talked about how he tried to hold on to them. And so there's more and more information that we were able to see laid out today in this very thorough indictment. And so now we will move on to the next phase. I will say, though, for anyone who thought that the wind was at their back going into this, they're now up against Judge Eileen Cannon, at least for the time being, unless she recuses herself or the case is taken away. This is the same judge, it's a Trump appointee, that once said that there should be a special master, appointed a special master in this case, to try to review whether or not the FBI should have seized those documents last summer from Mar-a-Lago in the first place. That's a judge whose opinion was later completely overruled by a 3-judge panel, 2 of those being Trump appointees themselves. So now they are up against a bit of a obstacle there with Eileen Cannon if she stays the judge on this case. But Again, lots of information, lots of detail behind these multiple counts.
Julia, thank you. Charles Coleman is still here with us, former prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst. So, Charles, as Julia just brought up, the judge, now it goes to this judge, a Trump-appointed judge. Should she recuse herself?
Well, I don't necessarily know that it's a question of her having to recuse herself, Vicky, but I do think that it's going to be interesting to watch how she approaches this case, given the very recent history she has with everything around it. At the end of the day, if you are a judge, regardless of whether you have a lifetime appointment, you don't like getting overruled and overturned by the higher courts. And so when you talk about other Trump-appointed judges at the appellate level turning around and overruling you in pretty blistering fashion, if you go back and you read that decision, the commentary there was not at all favorable. Even as the decision itself still went against her, they basically eviscerated all of her logic. And so I only bring that up because that has to be a thought in her mind if she's going to keep this case, which I fully expect she will do. And I cannot make the case that that is some sort of ethical violation. I think that that's totally fine. But I am curious to see as to whether that is going to play a role in how she moves forward overseeing this new matter, which is really the old matter that had previously been in front of her.
We talked earlier about this idea of a speedy trial and what that might look like, but take us to the next few days, next week, when we expect Donald Trump to appear in court for the first time in Miami, Florida. What will that look like?
You know, I think that there will be a lot of commotion, but ultimately it'll be very quiet. At the end of the day, we're not going to see the sparks fly until we have a trial date and folks show up to court ready to begin the actual trial. I think that from a lawyer's perspective, much of what we will see between now and then is going to be fairly pedestrian. Now, it may be headlines, sensationalized, Donald Trump's attorneys file for motion to dismiss, a motion to suppress. But at the end of the day, those are usually going to be very routine, very expected things that attorneys are going to do throughout the course of litigating any prosecution. There is going to be discovery disputes. There are going to be disputes about confidentiality. There are going to be the normal types of disputes. I think if there's anything that we should watch for, Jack Smith's office, very similar to Alvin Bragg's office here in Manhattan, may look to have some contours around Donald Trump's ability to talk about the case publicly. Maybe. I don't necessarily know that Jack Smith's going to go that far, but it's possible. But other than that, I'm not expecting much to happen. Tuesday will come, it will go, the charges will be read. I expect that he will be released on his own recognizance. Donald Trump is one of the most, if not the most recognizable person in the entire world right now. Where's he going to go? He's not going anywhere. And so the likelihood that they will not release him is very, very low. They're probably not going to take his passport as a courtesy. They will probably allow him to keep his passport. Now, whether he will be ordered that he is not to travel is a very different thing. But I do think that he will likely retain his passport. And then from
That's up to
that
that
point,
judge.
That's up to the judge. Yes,
Okay.
that's not statutory. That's the judge's discretion. And then after that point, a trial date will be set very far in the future, and the discovery process will begin.
Let's talk about the other person on this indictment who may not get any special courtesies or treatment, Walt Nauta.
Right.
What's happening right now, potentially, with the prosecution talking to him and seeing if he may, in fact, testify against Mr. Trump?
Well, it's very interesting. I think that people have to understand that Mr. Nauta was likely informed that he was also the target of the investigation at some point. And so this isn't the first time that he would have had an opportunity to cooperate with prosecutors. I do think that prosecutors are probably going to give him a tight window, and that window at this point would be extremely tight because you've had all this time. They previously reached out to him and or his counsel. And I'm saying this not because it's been reported, but because I'm a former prosecutor, and you would not have someone at this level who you did not at least try to flip and make an informant or make someone who make him cooperate with your investigation. So it may be that it took seeing your name on a federal indictment before it became very real to you and you decided, you know what? Maybe I do have information that I want to give to the Department of Justice and cut a deal. I expect that that may happen. I expect that that window, however, is going to be tight. And now that we've gotten to the place of an indictment, what they are willing to offer in terms of immunity, in terms of a deal, is going to be significantly compromised because now your information is already out there. So we're not going to be able to offer you the same deal that we may have offered you earlier in the investigation had you chosen to cooperate then.
Is it surprising or abnormal to you to see? I mean, we've never had a situation like this, so I guess everything is abnormal. But I look at this first page, and the first thing I thought was, wow, they put Walt Nauda's name right next to the former president of the United States, not a separate thing. Power-wise, they're very different levels here. Is that a play by the prosecutors?
It is not unusual, Ellison, but I do think that it is still a play. If you are the average individual and you are looking at a historic federal indictment and your name is right there in black and white under the former president of the United States of America, who by his own estimation is a multimillionaire, and you're a regular guy, and you see your name there, there is a psychological thing that kicks in where you are now feeling like I'm on an island by myself. Yes, he's my co-defendant, but we don't have the same lawyers and we don't have the same resources to get representation. And so there has got to be a sense of loneliness in the sense of, hey, if I don't cooperate, I'm fighting this battle by myself, because the other guy, i.e. Donald Trump, he's going forward using all of his resources and everything that he can to throw at this case. And I don't have very much to bargain with. So yes, from a psychological point, it is something that would normally put pressure on the average person, even as though it's still not something that's completely abnormal.
Charles, stand by for us. We want to go back to Ron Allen, who is in Florida right now. And Ron, you have some reaction from the former president on his Truth Social website.
Yes, and it's consistent, as you might expect, with the kinds of things that we've been hearing from the former president now for a very long time. He is attacking Jack Smith, the special counsel, and says that Smith's wife and he are both Trump haters. And he calls him a quote-unquote psycho. And he says that under the Presidential Records Act, he is allowed to do everything that is outlined in the indictment, which is, of course, not the view of the special counsel. Earlier, there were posts where he was urging people to go to support him. He's been doing fundraising online. And so this is what we're hearing from the president and former president, and this is what we expect to hear as this continues to play out. It'll be interesting to see what their reaction is from in the Republican field of contenders running for the nomination, or who have said they are. It'll be interesting to see if there is any change of sentiment in the broader public based on this detailed indictment. That certainly seems to be part of what the intention was to try and put a lot of information out there to perhaps try to change people's minds. But it seems that attitudes and thoughts and feelings about the former president, are so rigid that nothing may change, nothing may move. It remains to be seen. But again, a thorough diet of what about Biden on Truth Social, and what about Hillary Clinton and all that, and it goes on and on. But basically, the former president is pushing back hard, being consistent with the things that he's been saying, and we expect that to continue right through this case, as long as it takes to get to trial. And the other cases, of course, in New York and perhaps in Atlanta. And of course, this special counsel was also looking at January 6th. We haven't heard anything about what the status of that particular investigation is as well.
It's called whataboutism, as Danny Savalos puts it. Ron Allen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ron. Let's head back to D.C., where Julia Ainsley is standing by. Julia, I'm going to remind viewers here of what we are talking about in terms of charges. The former president indicted on 7 charges, a total of 37 counts. You were in the room as special counsel Jack Smith made a statement to the American public, a fairly short one. He did not take any questions, but there was a lot there. What stood out to you being in that room, particularly as someone who has spent a lot of time in her career, in her life, at press conferences like this and working, reporting along the realms of the Justice Department?
Yeah, it's interesting. And over that experience, what I have learned is oftentimes the side that speaks first can control the narrative. We saw that during Special Counsel Mueller when Attorney General Barr wanted to speak before the media saw the report. And just last night, we got the first word of this indictment when it was then sealed by former President Trump. And today, Jack Smith wasted very little time before weighing in. Now, Most of what Smith has investigated and uncovered is laid out in the indictment. He wants the charges to speak for itself. And some prosecutors would just leave it at that. We know Smith is someone who doesn't usually have a lot to say. He's a serious prosecutor. He's tried war crimes in The Hague. But he did want to make the point today to say that he had a very professional team that did their job with the utmost integrity. And he wanted to lay out how serious these charges were, that this is not just about Trump having to face the law like any other American would for the crimes that he may have committed, that they're laying out in this indictment, but also that these crimes have national security consequences, that it's something the American public should care about regardless of their political opinion of the former president. Here's what he had to say about those charges and why they matter.
Our laws that protect national defense information are critical to the safety and security of the United States, and they must be enforced. Violations of those laws put our country at risk.
The obstruction, the conspiracy, the movements, the very personal involvement that Trump had and how these documents were handled and moved and kept close to him and how they were stored, and the seriousness of what was in those documents, including military plans, nuclear capabilities, and other plans from other countries that may have tried to threaten the United States. All of that underlined the seriousness, the gravity, and why the former president is now facing up to 20 years in prison.
Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Julia, thank you so much. I want to turn to Charles Coleman, who's here on set with us for the last word. A lot of people asking, why did this move to southern Florida? What say you?
Well, the first and easiest answer, Vicky, is that, listen, as a prosecutor, you're supposed to file the case where most of the charges actually occurred, where most of the crimes occurred. Now, it's very important to understand that Jack Smith is taking a risk here because he's going into Donald Trump's backyard. And so there is a lot of support, which we've already heard, for the former president in that jurisdiction. And so even though there is support there, it's important to understand, on the other hand, it was still a grand jury of South Floridians in that same jurisdiction that voted to indict him. So it's very clear that Jack Smith feels very confident that he can get a conviction in this space, and more importantly, that he is not going to be pressured around the political implications of potentially moving it somewhere else where there would have been cries around the weaponization of the DOJ and this being a politicized prosecution. So Jack Smith has entered into uncharted territory, but with obviously a lot of evidence at his back, and it appears as though he is ready to take on whatever the challenges may be, even as he's in a firmly red state, to try to prosecute the former president.
All right, and is it true, there's a statistic floating around out there, that 90% of federal cases end in guilty pleas?
Higher than that. It's actually closer to literally 98, 99. When the Department of Justice brings a case, they are not messing around. They know what they're doing, and they're very experienced, and they are very, very good at getting convictions.
We'll take it straight from the former prosecutor. Charles Coleman, thank you.
Meet the Press Now starts right now.
Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez, in for Chuck Todd in Washington on a historic day and a fraught moment in this country. For the first time in American history, a former president has been indicted on federal charges. And not just any former president. He's also a declared candidate for president and the current frontrunner for the Republican nomination. A short time ago, the Justice Department unsealed a 37-count indictment against Donald Trump. A 49-page document filled with evidence, photographs, text messages, transcripts of audio recordings, witness accounts, and more. Taken together, it paints a damaging portrait of reckless and criminal behavior in handling some of the nation's most vital secrets. The 49-page indictment includes 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information, 1 count of false statements and representations, 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct, 1 count of withholding a document or record, 1 count of corruptly concealing a document or record, 1 count of concealing a document in a federal investigation, and 1 count of scheming to conceal. Minutes ago, Special Counsel Jack Smith spoke publicly for the first time since his appointment more than 6 months ago, as his office unsealed the charges against Mr. Trump.
The men and women of the United States intelligence community and our armed forces dedicate their lives to protecting our nation and its people. Our laws that protect national defense information are critical to the safety and security of the United States, and they must be enforced. Violations of those laws put our country at risk. Adherence to the rule of law is a bedrock principle of the Department of Justice, and our nation's commitment to the rule of law sets an example for the world. We have one set of laws in this country, and they apply to everyone.
Also implicated in today's indictment is Mr. Trump's personal aide and body man, Walt Nauta, who, according to the special counsel's office, helped Mr. Trump move boxes and conceal items from authorities. As you might expect, the former president has lashed out at the Justice Department and the special counsel's investigation. In one post minutes ago, he referred to the special counsel as a deranged psycho. And he posted this video last night after disclosing he had been summoned to the courthouse early next week to face these charges.
They can't stop because it's election interference at the highest level. There's never been anything like what's happened. I'm an innocent man. I'm an innocent person.
Now, beyond the legal implications of this indictment are, of course, the political implications. So far, we've seen Republicans from the Capitol to the campaign trail rally around the former president, and his allies in the House of Representatives are considering ways to potentially try to intervene in the special counsel's case. Meanwhile, President Biden has remained relatively quiet about the case. Here was his response earlier today when asked by reporters about the charges facing his potential 2024 rival.
Mr. President, are you concerned about the decision in light of the Trump indictment? If everybody could please call me.
President Biden, have you spoken to Attorney General Merrick Garland yet?
I have not spoken to him at all. I'm not going to speak to him. No comment on what happened.
We have a lot to unpack this hour, but let's first begin with the latest on this sweeping 37-count indictment against Mr. Trump. Joining me now from Miami is NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian, along with former federal prosecutor and legal affairs correspondent for Politico magazine, Renato Mariotti. And in a moment, I'll be joined by criminal defense attorney and NBC legal analyst Danny Savalos. Ken, let's start with you. Walk us through these 37 counts. What is the former president facing in this indictment?
Gabe, he's facing a devastating portrait of a willful misuse of classified information and an alleged conspiracy to obstruct justice. I've covered the intelligence community for more than a decade. I've covered a lot of classified document cases. I've never seen an indictment as detailed and as powerful as this one. You know, we should mention that obviously Donald Trump is innocent until proven guilty, but the details in this document are amazing. First of all, the impact and the moment of the documents itself that he had. And in paragraph 3 of the indictment, it says that the documents that Trump had included information regarding defense and weapons capabilities of both the United States and foreign countries, United States nuclear programs, potential vulnerabilities of the U.S. and its allies to military attack, and plans for possible retaliation in response to a foreign attack. And it goes on to say that the unauthorized disclosure of these documents puts at risk U.S. national security, intelligence sources, and methods. And then the indictment says that on at least 2 occasions, Donald Trump did disseminate classified material to people who didn't have clearance to see it. And in one case, there's a recording of it. And there's a transcript of that recording laid out in this indictment. There's also a transcript of a recording that we know was made by one of Donald Trump's lawyers. So there's so many remarkable pieces of evidence in this that you don't normally see in a case like this. And just for context, Gabe, last week, an Air Force colonel was sentenced to 3 years in prison in a case where he was convicted of taking about 300 classified documents home over a course of years. No allegation that he shared the documents with anyone. No allegation that he obstructed justice. He got 3 years. This case is much more serious, and the obstruction of justice conspiracy is like a whole separate part of the case that alleges that Donald Trump conspired with his body man, Walt Nauta, to conceal and tried to enlist his lawyers in a scheme to conceal the fact that he had these documents even after the Justice Department came after him with a subpoena. And what you see as you read through this indictment is none of this had to happen. If if Donald Trump had simply given these documents back the first time the government asked, this case would not have happened and we would not be here, Gabe.
Yeah, and Ken, this seems to be what's called a speaking indictment, of course. And really, as you look through it, it really tells a story here. Talk to me, Ken, about how this feels different than the other indictment a short time ago, a couple of months ago now, with the hush money case. How does this feel different than the state indictment up in New York?
Yeah, not to take anything away from that indictment, there's an argument to be made. It's an important enforcement of the rule of law in New York. But that indictment is very technical. It has to do with tax and business expenses. It was brought by an elected Democratic prosecutor, and almost immediately, even the most moderate anti-Trump Republicans dismissed that indictment as a political attack. Whether you believe that or not, that was their reaction. This is going to be much harder to do with this federal indictment, although people obviously are doing it, because this was an indictment brought by a career federal prosecutor who was not under the day-to-day supervision of Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States. The only role of Merrick Garland here was that he could have blocked any action by Special Counsel Jack Smith if, according to the regs, that action was so outside the normal practices of the Justice Department that it shouldn't go forward. That didn't happen, obviously. Jack Smith made these decisions on his own. That's why you saw Jack Smith today, not Merrick Garland, giving that news conference or that statement at his separate offices away from the Justice Department. So that's why this feels different. And also, it's a federal case, right? And so what you're going to have when Donald Trump surrenders on Tuesday is this remarkable picture of the former president, the man who was in charge of the federal government, now being fingerprinted and his mugshot taken and his passport taken away by the very government that he used to lead, Gabe.
And Ken, Renato, before I get to you, Ken, I just want to ask you very quickly. Walt Nauta, the body man, he's also been indicted. Can you dig into what role prosecutors allege that he played?
Well, what they say is that he helped Donald Trump conceal the fact that he had many more classified documents than he was willing to let on, and move boxes of those documents when the government was trying to find them. So before, for example, the Justice Department came down to visit, this indictment alleges that Walt Nauta took more than 60 boxes of documents outside of that famous storage room in Mar-a-Lago. And Gabe, we know from our own reporting that the Justice Department gave Walt Nauta and his lawyers a chance to come clean and to cooperate, and he just refused to do it. And his lawyers are being paid by a Donald Trump political organization. So right now he's facing some very serious charges. Now, whether he stays on Team Trump and maintains solidarity with Donald Trump in the face of this serious criminal case remains to be seen. But that's what they say. They allege a conspiracy between Donald Trump and his butler and body man to obstruct justice.
And Renato, what's your reaction to this indictment? You know, is this the best possible case the DOJ could have brought?
No question. I think it's fair to say that this indictment is more problematic for Trump, more serious than all of his other legal problems put together. This is an absolutely devastating indictment, very difficult to overcome. And I think a big part of his strategy here would have to be to create so much delay that he is in poor health or has ended his life before it actually gets to trial. Because I think that it'll be very challenging to explain away the obstructive statements with his attorney in particular. I think very challenging to explain why he's saying that, they should lie to the Justice Department and say they have no documents, to suggest that he praised an attorney who had destroyed documents allegedly. So just some comments that are very challenging to explain. And Ken mentioned, of course, that recording where he's talking about a document that he said he could have declassified, but he didn't, and it's secret, but he's nonetheless sharing it. Very challenging. And I will say also the breadth of documents at issue here, over 30, I think it's 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information, including nuclear secrets, for example. I think it's going to be very challenging for Trump and his team to explain to the jury why those are not important secrets to keep. So I just think on its face, this is not only a very devastating case, but it's a very straightforward type of case to prove and a very difficult case to explain away. And that's a very big host of problems all in one for the former president.
And Renato, in your role as a former federal prosecutor, you kind of touched on this just now, but do you think those recordings are the most crucial piece of evidence here?
I think so. I think they're extraordinarily important. I think, it depends on the way you look at it. The most important piece of evidence is the classified information found in his residence, right? In other words, that was what started all this. That's the proof in the pudding. You're seeing it on the screen right now. I think in many ways, this case is very different than the other legal problems that we've seen Trump have. A lot of the Trump matters have been white collar cases where there's a focus on his state of mind. Did he have the intent to defraud? Did he have the intent to obstruct? And the thing about the willful retention of classified material, it's sort of like a drug case. If you have meth in your garage or in your house or in your office, that's a crime. And everyone knows that meth is not lawful to possess, or heroin is not lawful to possess. Those documents, it's apparent that after he's president, he is not lawfully possessing those documents, particularly, and I agree with Ken on this point, particularly when the Justice Department is trying desperately to get that stuff back. And to use the words of Bill Barr, the former Attorney General, you're jerking them around. And of course, as we see from this indictment, there's lies that are being fed and alleged conspiracy to obstruct justice. I just think that's very challenging to explain away. And that at the core, putting the obstructive conduct to the side, the fact that he wanted those documents very badly, that he shared them, that he was desperate to keep them, I think that's very, very challenging to explain.
And I want to bring in Danny Ceballos now. Danny, put on your defense attorney hat here. How do you even go about defending this? Can you?
This is the rare case where we have gotten a preview of how the defense might approach this case. We've gotten it in a letter defense attorneys wrote to Congress, and we've gotten it through interviews that defense counsel and now former defense counsel have given on network news shows. And it may go something like this. Whether it's effective or not remains to be seen. But you may see a narrative where the defense develops a theme that early and often Trump, when he was approached by these agencies, he may not have turned over documents immediately, but he wanted to see what documents he could take and not take. And that initially, when the National Archives wanted these documents, that Trump's team was willing to work with them. And they will probably develop the theme, if they are able to make this into admissible evidence, a form of whataboutism. In other words, that the National Archives with other presidents set up an infrastructure to help them with the president to ex-president transition and the moving of documents. His defense team might argue that Trump didn't have the benefit of that, and if there was a haphazard removal of documents, it was inadvertent. They will probably argue that when the government set a deadline for the subpoena, they were inflexible. They didn't allow rolling production. They set an arbitrary date. But really, whether or not any of that's even admissible, let alone probative of a defense, is not really even a sure thing. But at least in terms of the general narrative they may try to put out there, it's probably going to center around inadvertence. And then the government will have the burden to prove this was much more than an accident. This was much more than an oops. This was something that was deliberate. And so far, they've made a lot of those facts out as alleged in the indictment.
And Danny, I'm looking through this indictment right now. You can see on page 19, it says, a message between Trump employees. And one of these employees sends a text saying, quote, he's tracking the boxes. And Danny, I want to talk about, early on, might a defense have been, look, he's a former president. He has a lot on his mind. He may have not actually known the details of where these boxes were. He wasn't paying close attention to it. He could perhaps say that this was something his employees did. But according to this, page 19 of the indictment, it appears that the former president knew exactly where they were and was asking them to be moved. How does former President Trump's team defend against specifically that?
I think you've hit on the major theme. Why are we here with this defendant? And it goes back to your two words, early on. I suspect this could have been averted if early on, and I think the Maginot line here is the time when agencies other than DOJ were involved, when the National Archives was saying, we would like our documents back. I fully believe that had Donald Trump negotiated and gotten those documents back before other agencies felt it necessary to make a referral to DOJ, we never would have been here. In fact, that's an argument that the defense is making. They're making the argument that this started out as National Archives using a federal statute that doesn't have any punitive measures, but they just wanted the documents back. Maybe the defense doesn't realize they're inadvertently making the prosecution's argument, which is only by escalating to this to the point that the National Archives and the other agency felt that they needed to refer this to DOJ, that was a line that was crossed. That was the point of no return. That was the event horizon. After that point, once DOJ was involved, you arguably already have intent of all of these, and I call them overlapping elements. I think concealment shares a lot in common with hiding documents or retaining documents or some of the other overlapping Venn diagram elements that are contained in this indictment.
And Ken, I want to go back to you. And as I'm going through this indictment as well, something that really jumped out at me that I thought was very interesting is there were several instances spread throughout the indictment where the special counsel's office decided to put in quotes from things that Donald Trump had said back in 2016 when it came to the handling of classified information. Of course, back then he was talking about Hillary Clinton. But why do you think that the special counsel's office found it necessary to put those specific quotes throughout this document? Was it a type of storytelling device, or was it perhaps to show that the former president should have known better?
I think both, Gabe. I mean, this is, as one of our guests said, the ultimate speaking indictment. And the Justice Department knew that they're not just speaking to an audience here of jurors or of the media, they're speaking to the whole country, half of whom is predisposed to doubt this case. And so they needed to put as much information there as possible. You know, the average person doesn't really deal with classified documents and doesn't maybe understand why they're so sensitive and what the implications are of taking them outside of a sensitive facility. And so the Justice Department thought, well, maybe we'll inject some of what Donald Trump himself has said about this to help sort of fill out the picture. And they did a lot of different devices in this indictment to sort of try to explain why this matters. And then you heard Jack Smith. That was the theme of his remarks, really, is, the men and women of the intelligence community risk their lives to protect this information. That's why it's so important. And if I could just dovetail on something you said, Gabe, not only did Trump know where the boxes were, all throughout this thing, many Trump defenders said, well, it's not like the president packed his own boxes when he left the White House. Actually, this indictment alleges he did in some cases. He was actually, according to this indictment, involved in packing his own boxes. So he was personally involved in taking some of this material from the White House to Mar-a-Lago, Gabe.
Incredible, some of the details that we learned just a few hours ago when this indictment was unsealed. Renato, I want to bring you back in, and I want to mention that this indictment includes the exchange captured on the recording at Bedminster. According to the transcript, former President Trump says, as president, I could have declassified them. Now I can't, but this is still a secret. How key is that piece of evidence?
Oh, it may very well be the most important piece of evidence in the whole indictment. I mean, there's different ways of looking at it. One thing I will say is, we often talk on shows like this about the downside of a person who's under criminal investigation speaking out. And here is part of the downside. Donald Trump, when he realized that the FBI had raided his residence, could have kept his mouth shut. But instead, he went on every program possible. He went on podcasts, he went on recordings, and he talked about what his defense was. He was telling Sean Hannity that his defense was that he declassified these things with his mind. And of course, he locked himself into what a defense might be here. And the prosecutors wisely have developed evidence that totally undercut that defense. And by the way, actually prove some of the charges that they've set out elsewhere. For example, he says that he knows that this information is secret, but he's sharing it with you anyway. As we noted a moment ago, that's transmittal of information. It shows his knowledge that it's a secret. So I just think the fact of the matter is, this is just incredibly challenging. I mean, I thought Denny did a very nice job of setting out a potential defense. And often on the defense side, you're trying to just throw mud against the wall, trying to see what sticks. But it's just very challenging to run together a thread that resembles an actual credible defense that would actually get you out from under these charges. I will just say that it's very challenging, and I know this from experience on the defense side. I've been on the defense side for many years as well. very challenging to get the jury to select not guilty, vote not guilty, and check that box 30-something times, 37 times. Even if one time they select guilty, that's the end for Donald Trump.
And Ken, before we go, I want to bring up something. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida says the DNI has not provided Congress with an assessment of potential risk to national security from these documents. Why not?
Well, one theory is they don't want to create a discoverable document that then gets injected into the trial. Because if they do a damage assessment, you can make an argument that Donald Trump and his attorneys will have a right to have it, and that could be a problem. But they are required by ODNI policy to eventually do a damage assessment, Gabe.
Ken, Danny, Renato, thank you all for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. And let me turn now to Rahema Ellis, who's outside Mr. Trump's New Jersey home in Bedminster, New Jersey. And Rahema, it's good to see you. Is Trump's reaction to this indictment, a redo of the Manhattan indictment?
It seems to be that way. The former president has been busy today playing golf with a Republican congressman from Florida, Carlos Jimenez, but he also was busy on his social media site. Shortly after Jack Smith made his statement about the indictment, the former president took to his social media and said something to the effect of Biden moved his boxes all over the place, including Chinatown and up to his lawyers in Boston. Why isn't deranged Jack Smith looking at that? He goes on and in another post, he says something to the effect of, this is crazy, just like Jack Smith. In addition, he says also on his social media site that they all spied on my campaign. Nothing is beyond them. So, yes, he is reacting. It's very much like the kind of thing he did after the charges were revealed on him in Manhattan. And we'll see if this continues. This is pretty much the way the former president reacts. This is not unusual. I don't think anybody is surprised by this. The question becomes one of, will it continue?
Yeah, and Rahema, we just saw just a few hours ago, with the former president on social media, as you said, attacking the special counsel in such personal terms. But talk to me a little bit as well about the video that he posted last night. What were some of the arguments he was making there? He called himself an innocent man. But do we have any indication of how his team and, likely his campaign plans to deal with this in the coming days? Do we expect these attacks against the special counsel to escalate, Rahema?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised unless someone suggests to him and convincingly can suggest to him that his team refrain from doing this kind of thing. Even last night, it appears very clear that the Trump team was prepared for this. He had said so himself on social media that he was expecting himself to be indicted, and he wasn't being casual about that expectation, because shortly after the word was revealed last night that he was being indicted, less than an hour after learning that news, the Trump campaign sent out a fundraising email. This is very much what we saw happen in the Manhattan case. And they raised some $12 million after putting out fundraising emails and videos in that regard. So that was very profitable for them. And they may be hoping that they can do the same kind of thing here, because the legal defense charges, in terms of the cost of these charges, is only growing, Gabe. It's not shrinking, it's growing. So again, unless someone will say to the president he can be convinced that he should change his ways, it seems like his team is poised to try and control the narrative in terms of the public relations events their way, which is going after the people who are filing charges against them and attacking them in some very clear language.
Rahema Ellis in New Jersey. Rahema, the Trump team fundraising just minutes after this indictment was announced. We'll see how this plays out. Rahema, thank you. And up next, Trump world chaos, reaction from the Republican presidential field, and how far the former president's allies in Congress will go to defend him. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
back now from Las Vegas, Seattle, Guatemala City, from Wilmington. I was in space in Texas, from Normandy, from Surfside, Florida. Thank you for watching, everyone.
Hey, podcast fans, ready to unlock our true crime mysteries? Try Dateline Premium on Apple Podcasts. You'll get early access to originals, plus bonus content, and everything is ad-free. So head to Apple Podcasts now to subscribe.
And welcome back. As we noted, ahead of the unsealing of the special counsel's sweeping indictment against former President Trump, a number of Mr. Trump's Republican primary rivals had rushed to his defense. His chief rival, Ron DeSantis, along with Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, have all echoed Trump's attacks on the Department of Justice, decrying politicization and weaponization. We haven't heard from them since the charges were released. Another Republican primary candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy, went as far as saying he would pardon Trump if he is elected president. And at the same time, Asa Hutchinson called on Trump to drop out of the race. And then there's former Vice President Mike Pence, who's taken a more nuanced view. Take a listen to what he said to reporters just before the charging document was released.
I think it's deeply troubling to see an indictment against a former president of the United States. I had hoped that the Department of Justice would see its way clear to resolve this matter without an indictment. That being said, let me be clear on a few points. No one is above the law. And in America, we have to stand on the rule of law, irrespective of politics. Secondly, the handling of classified materials is a very serious matter.
Given the indictment, should Trump suspend his campaign at this point?
No, I think any consideration of that would be premature. Look, everyone is innocent until proven guilty in America. I think the former president has a right to make his defense.
And we have a supersized panel to help navigate this historic moment. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale, AP White House reporter Darlene Superville, senior advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders, Faz Shakir, and Republican strategist Doug Heye. Thank you so much for joining Meet the Press Now. And Darlene, I want to start with you. Big picture, what is your reaction to this historic indictment? What stuck out to you?
What stuck out to me is what's always stuck out to me, which is the question of why. Like, why did Donald Trump take these documents? He didn't have to be in this position, right? He could have returned documents when the government and the National Archives asked him to return them, but he resisted, and this is what many in Washington would call a self-inflicted wound, and he did not have to be here.
And that's what we were talking about earlier, right? What would have happened if they had just given them back? Or not fought the returning of these documents. So that is a huge question here. And Ali, I want to turn to you. Republican allies of Donald Trump, they have walked a fine line here, but almost all of them yesterday came out and backed him, including Governor DeSantis. Even Nikki Haley had an interesting comment today. But I want to get to you. Have we seen any indication in the last few hours that there has been any shift in the Republican narrative here, or at least how many people are backing the former president?
No, it feels like all the people who would usually back him are backing him. The people who would usually be the first to point out his wrongdoing are doing so. Senator Mitt Romney said something akin to what you said, which is that Donald Trump brought this on himself. He didn't have to be in this position. And then, of course, their allies, even though they're technically his rivals, the people who want the same job that Trump is trying to get, are all trying to also stack themselves behind them. I actually think the one who did the most artful response was probably Pence, who left himself the ability to pivot in either direction, saying it's weaponization and politicization, but also saying that no one is above the law. That allows him, I think, the best position to pivot from going forward, even as he's not saying Trump should drop out like Asa Hutchinson is.
Right, and he said he wanted to hear the facts come out. Right. So is Chris Christie. Well, now that the facts are out, it should be interesting to say if that message shifts in the next couple hours or the coming days. Doug, I want to turn to you. The last time that former President Trump was indicted, by the way, can we just say
that's
not a normal sentence. Yeah, exactly. The last time he was indicted, we saw his poll numbers go up. Do you think that happens here?
I don't think we know yet. And, when you say the next few hours and days are going to be indicative of this, you're exactly right. And it's because it's 6 o'clock tonight Ron DeSantis is speaking to the North Carolina Republican Convention. Tomorrow at noon, Mike Pence is speaking, and then Donald Trump, 6 o'clock tomorrow, will be speaking. So all eyes are going to be in Greensboro, North Carolina. And if you've now seen what the details are in this indictment, it gives you political permission to make the separation. In politics, when you have an opportunity, you're supposed to take it. They didn't take it with the first indictment, and there were good reasons for that. A lot of people, even Democrats, thought this is political or not the indictment that you wanted. Again, a weird statement. This is very different. It's very serious. It's federal. And if you're Pence and if you're DeSantis and you want to create separation from Donald Trump, you've got your opportunity right now, and you have the venue to do it.
But they may also have the opportunity to alienate some of his supporters, which is, of course, what can be difficult here. And by the way, this isn't the last investigation; it was also the Georgia investigation.
Well, and we know that the Republican nomination doesn't go around Donald Trump. It goes through Donald Trump. You can't hope that somebody else is going to do your job for you. The politics here should be rather static. You have an opportunity, take it. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. They haven't done so yet. Again, tonight and tomorrow, they have the opportunity and the venue.
Maybe on the third indictment.
Maybe. Well, Faz, I want to turn to you. President Biden and the White House has not touched this so far. Do they have any choice? How do Democrats play this moving forward?
Well, you got to honor the legal case, which is to take it out of a political realm and say that the facts are pretty damn strong, as you see in the characterization. You almost have a caricature of a comic book villain of Donald Trump who's showing off his trophy case or his baseball signed by Babe Ruth. The things that we don't know that don't come through yet, and the reason why the White House has to hold, and I think a lot of the Republicans are going to hold, is who else was he talking to about this material? Because all we learned through the indictment is we've talked to a couple of individuals writing a book or journalists or whatever. Isn't it possible that a lot of people traveled through Mar-a-Lago? Who else is he talking to about classified materials involving military strikes and what Iran might do, what Iran might not do? And I think that ends up coloring so much of the political case. Right, and that's different from a legal case. And I think Doug was making this point that politically you have to hold a bit to allow some of this color. And presumably a lot of that might be on tape or on audio and other forms that we don't even know.
But I would add, too, that the White House is holding partly also because they don't want to be seen as playing any role or having any, input in what is happening to the former president.
But that said, the challenge for President Biden, obviously as the leader of a government, is that you have to honor that the DOJ is going to conduct a thorough investigation. I stand with the FBI, who does an honorable job serving. Yes, I'm not going to meddle in this case. However, you do have a role of defending that, which you could see Mike Pence's answer was suggesting that if you put me in charge as president, I too would respect law enforcement. Whereas the others, right, they're all staking claims where, like, yeah, if you put me in charge, I will screw law enforcement. I might fire all these guys, which is a radical position to take.
Allie, I want to get to you because you, of course, were with former President Trump back in 2016.
Yeah.
That's when we met. I was following
It is when we met.
And you saw him speak about Hillary Clinton back then, over and over again. Let's actually play some of that.
In my administration, I'm going to enforce all laws concerning the protection of classified information. No one will be above the law.
Hillary is likely to be under investigation for many years, probably concluding in a criminal trial.
If she were to win this election, it would create an unprecedented constitutional crisis. In that situation, we could very well have a sitting president under felony indictment and ultimately a criminal trial. Her current scandals and controversies will continue throughout her presidency, and we will make it, honestly, look, it's going to be virtually impossible for her to govern.
It is surreal to hear those words. Now, what do you make of that, Allie? Listening to that 7 years later, and here we are.
I mean, if we were to rewrite Alanis Morissette's Ironic, you'd need to put a line in about that because he's saying the exact thing that ends up playing out now for him. It's partly why you see Hillary Clinton posting a But Her Emails picture on Instagram because you almost have to just call out the hypocrisy of that. I do think it's stunning, though, that this is exactly how it happened. He made so much hay of the emails, and then there was a misuse of email within his administration. You saw him now say that I would take care of classified documents. Now he's taking them back to Mar-a-Lago. I mean, you couldn't write it better than this way. And that's why I'm actually surprised that more of his opponents aren't jumping on this, because it's such a clear example of, if you want to be the law and order party, this is law and order, is defending national security. And I think to make this case to the public, and as we watch this case move through, how do prosecutors prove this to a jury? How do they say it's Iran? This is detrimental to national. That's going to be a huge part of selling this to the public too.
And Darlene, how do you see this playing out? Because we at this point are expecting the other trial potentially in March of next year, the hush money trial. We don't know yet the timeline for this one, but chances are it will, potentially line up just as this presidential election is ramping up. How do you see this playing with the Republican Party and potentially backing a candidate who is facing a federal criminal trial?
It's a little time will tell kind of a situation. Trump has a lot of support with the base. I think that we need some time to see whether a lot of those people will stick with him or take the information that's in this indictment and say, enough is enough, I've had enough, I don't want this person, someone who would be this callous with classified information, to be president.
Doug, I want to switch over to something that you said. You said that this could be potentially the opportunity. Look, I've been with Governor DeSantis on the trail the last couple of weeks. I just don't see him. He's been very careful, of course, in his stump speeches, not to mention Trump. He only talks about it when he's directly asked. Is there any way that you can see him potentially pivoting to attacking Donald Trump's drama here? But he's gone so far to attack the weaponization of the DOJ, he's kind of boxed himself into a corner now, hasn't he?
Well, I think you can do both at the same time. DeSantis sort of made that remark of, I don't know anything about paying hush money to strippers and things like that.
Right.
You can highlight the drama, and you can say, regardless of whether or not Donald Trump did something wrong or not, there's too much drama around him, too much chaos. He can't focus 100% on beating Joe Biden, and by God, we need a Republican who's going to focus on beating Biden. That's a message that can sell, and it ties directly into Ron DeSantis's I'm a winner message, and we lose too much with Donald Trump, especially when you consider the independent voters, the people who voted for Donald Trump voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and Joe Biden in 2020, that flipped Arizona for him, made North Carolina so close. Those are voters who are not going back to Donald Trump. And all of this ties into the DeSantis I'm a winner argument.
Right, and Allie, I think Nikki Haley is trying to make the argument too, or trying to have it both ways, attacking the drama but saying the weaponization. Do you think that's going to fly with her?
And not mentioning him by name at all. I don't think that you can be too cute by half. I actually think that's a great argument to make. Tackling this through the lens of electability is a really good argument for people, because Republicans just want to win back the White House. But no one is actually making that explicit argument. And I do think for voters, A, you can't have them infer that that's your argument. Someone needs to say it. But B, the reality is that this legal process is going to drag on for months. And we could have voters who voted in Iowa, New Hampshire, even South Carolina and Nevada before this has even hit court. He could end up stitching up the nomination and then potentially getting indicted. And I think for voters, asking them to entertain that as a possibility, every candidate should do that, because that is a central focus here that they're not going to just infer. You got to put it right in front of them. And
Buzz, I want to kind of wrap up with you. You were with the candidate back in 2016. Obviously, Bernie Sanders that had a lot to deal with in terms of classified documents and the whole Hillary Clinton emails thing. He famously said, "We don't care about your emails." How is this different? Because the argument that many Republicans will make is like, well, Hillary Clinton wasn't prosecuted. This is, voters don't care about this stuff. How is this?
I mean, it's certainly a gift for President Biden and his reelect campaign. I mean, the fear of Trump certainly was a mobilizing factor for many Democrats, plus 50% of the country. For Biden, who has his own weaknesses right now with animation and excitement and passion, he's going to get it out of the Trump case. And I think for many people, I get the electability arguments for it. Many people are just going to say, can you imagine putting that guy back in charge as president for 4 more years with that kind of deranged conduct, that kind of deranged mentality, a person scorned by the FBI, you put him back in charge? What's he going to do to the government? What's he going to do to everybody around him? Who would want to work for him? Those kinds of common sense thoughts, I think, are going to mobilize the 50% majority in this country to say, oh no, we're not going down that road again.
Well, a supersized panel on a historic day. Allie, Darlene, Boz, Doug, thank you all so much for joining Meet the Press Now. We really appreciate it. Some of you are actually sticking around. And as we mentioned, we've not heard much from Donald Trump's competitors for the Republican presidential nomination since the full details of his indictment were released by the Justice Department this afternoon. But here's some of what we heard from his chief rival, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, last night. Quote, the weaponization of federal law enforcement represents a mortal threat to a free society. The DeSantis administration will bring accountability to the DOJ, excise political bias, and end weaponization once and for all. Joining me now is Ken Cuccinelli. He's the founder of the Never Back Down Super PAC that is supporting Governor DeSantis. He was also, of course, a top official at the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration. Ken, thanks so much for joining Meet the Press Now. So, Ken, Governor DeSantis put out that statement before the charges released. So, after seeing the evidence today, Ken, should he change his tune?
So, I don't think so. I think that he is on the right track. It's one he's been on for some time. He's stated a more general level. Surely this indictment is nothing like the one in New York. Nonetheless, in the context of Hillary, Obama, Biden having their own document issues, the average American isn't going to see it much deeper than that and sees the bias that takes place not just in this case for bringing it. And mind you, I was a state attorney general. There's a difference between whether you've got someone dead to rights and if what reads out in the indictment is accurate. You know, there's a strong technical case here against the president. That's a different question from whether the case ought to be brought, just like it was in Hillary's situation, and as is ongoing with Joe Biden himself. This will put a lot of pressure on the Department of Justice to actually bring the Biden case. But DeSantis is still on the same path he has been on, and that is the de-weaponization of the justice system. And I think that's something that Americans look forward to. And I see him being very consistent on that. And we're happy to echo that here at Never Back Down.
But Ken, you seem, in your answer, you seem to suggest that this is different from the previous hush money case. Do you think this is a stronger case?
Yes, simply because the New York case, the district attorney there essentially made up a new legal theory to charge Trump with. That is not the case here. These are longstanding statutes, and there was a lot more detail in this indictment for your viewers than the average indictment includes.
If this case is stronger, as you just said, why bring up that it shouldn't have been brought in the first place?
Well, because you still have a situation, this is brought not in by itself. There's everything else going on in our society. And when you have a Department of Justice that continues to show demonstrated bias, they cannot expect to bring a case like this.
So you're bringing up a political argument, Ken.
You asked me a question, I'm answering it. And the American people to see it as being made on an objective basis. And that's what Governor DeSantis is going after hard and fast. And he's made some very firm statements about things he'll do about that, and I appreciate that.
And we do appreciate you coming on here, Ken, and answering questions, but the point I was trying to make, if you think that this is a stronger case, and you bring up the politicization of the Justice Department, but if the facts are there, no one should be above the law, right?
Well, certainly that's the rule of law is a fundamental American precept, and it's been one that's been bent and abused rather badly over the last 10 years by the FBI and this Department of Justice. They're not in a position to simply expect people to view their actions without being as coming through a political lens, and this just continues that path. I do not think the president's supporters will respond to this in the same way they did the New York indictment. I was listening to your conversation about the drama. That is wearing on people. It is going to be a different response, but I do expect you're going to see the same response from Governor DeSantis, and that is a commitment at the general level to get into the Department of Justice and to depoliticize it. That's something that every American should want.
And Ken, you mentioned the drama. So do you agree with that argument? Do you agree that Donald Trump just has too much drama and should not be the Republican nominee? Because that seems to be the argument that you're making. The candidate that you're backing, though, has not made that argument so explicitly yet.
Well, the way you ask it is sort of binary. I would say that it is an important factor for an awful lot of folks. And I've traveled to a lot of states already, talked to a lot of grassroots folks and grassroots leaders who don't appreciate the drama. This is not a plus for the president. And when you compare it to Governor DeSantis's much more effective governing style in Florida, that is a stark contrast. And it weighs very heavily in the governor's favor with ordinary voters. You've heard of Trump derangement syndrome. There's also Trump exhaustion syndrome. And that's among many of us who have or had supported him.
And Ken, I want to read something from the indictment. The government alleges that the classified documents Mr. Trump stored in his boxes included information regarding defense and weapons capabilities of both the U.S. and foreign countries, United States nuclear programs. The unauthorized disclosure of these classified documents could put at risk the national security of the United States. Bottom line, should he have had those in his possession after he left the White House?
Certainly not. He shouldn't have had, and no president should have any classified documents even after they leave the White House. Bottom line, I think you see a focus here on the national security documents as opposed to all classified documents. That's the only limitation I really see the Department of Justice having imposed on itself in bringing this indictment.
So why can't Governor DeSantis and other Republican candidates say what you just said?
Well, perhaps they will. Honestly, I've read most, but not all of the 49 pages so far. We're all still digesting this in greater detail. I think that that's going to take a little while for that dust to settle. People are going to want to see what happens on Tuesday in Miami. I don't think there'll be new information, but one never knows. I mean, some of this information came out before today from unofficial sources, and it's an interesting question to know. How did CNN get the recording of the president on audio? And those are other questions that, you know, really leave people with concerns of the politicization of this that undermines what on paper might otherwise be a strong case.
And Ken, I know you're with the super PAC backing Governor DeSantis and not with the actual campaign, but
right.
Do you think that Governor DeSantis would pardon former President Trump?
Oh, I have no idea. That's one of those questions that only he can answer. And, you know, that's a long way off. Right. But as your earlier panel talked about, it is a long way off, but there's going to be trials between here and there on a number of these issues. And that kind of drama does not weigh well with ordinary Republican voters. It is not a plus for the president. And having a leader who's already proven, like Governor DeSantis, who doesn't bring all of that baggage, is very attractive to people all across America.
And Ken, I want to ask you something about something that former Vice President Pence said earlier today that other Republican candidates have said as well, including Governor DeSantis. They've really made a point of saying that they would clean house at the DOJ. Do you agree with that, given that you just said that this indictment is stronger than the previous one? So I understand you have questions about whether it should have been brought at all, but why say that you should clean house at the DOJ if the DOJ did its job here?
Well, let's set this case aside entirely and still point out there are reasons to clean house at DOJ and the FBI because of the 10 years of politicized behavior that I talked about that is now extremely well documented, including lying in courts and lying to the American people by DOJ, by the FBI. There's an awful lot of cleaning out that has to happen. Unfortunately, you would have expected the director, say, of the FBI to do part of that. That's a Trump appointee that he has complained about and that Governor DeSantis has said he would remove on day one. He has failed to depoliticize the FBI, and Governor DeSantis is committing to put others in who will.
Ken Cuccinelli, founder of Never Back Down, the super PAC backing Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Ken, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
So even in the face of today's historic indictment, President Biden is staying the course and staying out of former President Trump's legal troubles. President Biden today visited with service members and their families in Fort Liberty, North Carolina, a state he narrowly lost to Mr. Trump in 2020. When asked to respond to the Trump grand jury indictment, he said he had no comment. The White House declined to comment on the news earlier today and yesterday appointed reporters to the Department of Justice, emphasizing that the DOJ conducts criminal investigations independently from the administration. So I want to bring in NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli, who joins me now live from Fort Liberty, North Carolina. And Mike, how is the White House responding to this latest news, the details of the indictment, and how successful has the president been at staying out of...
Well, Gabe, the point is that they're not responding. This has been really the posture of the White House really since day one of the administration, and it's both a political imperative and a legal necessity. On the politics, I remember very well covering candidate Joe Biden, who repeatedly promised to the voters in the 2020 campaign that he would not treat the Justice Department as his personal defense attorney, which was his view of how Bill Barr was acting in the Trump Justice Department. And he also continued to, he understands full well how Republicans are treating this moment, trying to accuse his administration of politicizing itself, of attacking a political opponent, weaponizing the Justice Department. So that part is really the politics here. The legality is so critical, though, to this administration because the president is himself the subject of a special counsel investigation. The White House has argued that the Pence special probe into his handling of classified documents was much closer to what happened in the Biden case, the improper but, well-intentioned bad packing, perhaps, of documents versus the very clear, as the Justice Department is laying out in this case, laying out of Trump's handling of it. So it's a very different case. But that's why it was so interesting what Peter Alexander was able to get the president to say yesterday at that news conference to talk about this moment when the impartiality of the Justice Department is being questioned, at least by Republicans, and may be an attempt to undermine the public confidence on this. The president saying he's never once done this, that he believes it is completely independent. And as he also put it, in his case, I'm honest, the former president's not. Even that brief comment is an overstepping of the line in the view of some in the White House, and that's why he's been kept at a distance as much as they can today. Just wrapped up this event here.
And Mike, I want to get your take on something that allies of former President Trump have been trying to argue throughout the day and really over the last several days. This idea that President Biden or that Attorney General Merrick Garland somehow authorized this indictment. How does the president and the White House plan to counter that narrative that it was somehow Biden's Department of Justice that authorized this indictment against the former president?
Well, they're just simply reiterating that this is something that was handled by the Attorney General at a very early stage, and that handling of it was to defer to a special counsel. Listen, Gabe, there's been some concern, some frustration even with the Attorney General inside this administration that he's been too much of a Boy Scout, perhaps. This is a former judge. Remember, he was the chief judge on the second highest court of the land, the D.C. Circuit, and he's acted perhaps too much like a judge to some in the White House. But that being said, that Boy Scout behavior is something that is serving the administration well in this moment because they feel, for instance, that it was unequal treatment of Attorney General Garland not to appoint a special counsel for the Pence case versus what he did in the case of President Biden. But there's only so much that this White House can ultimately do, and they're not going to engage in a tit-for-tat with these Republicans. You're just going to continue to hear from the White House over and over again, no comments, and to say what they said earlier today, which is they only learned of all these developments over the course of the last 24 hours from public news reports.
And Mike Memoli traveling with President Biden in North Carolina. Mike, thank you. And for some final thoughts, back with me now is our panel, NBC's Ali Vitale, Faz Shakir, and Doug Heye. Just so much to unpack here. Ali, I want to start with you. Final thoughts as we end this historic day. Where does this go from here, and what do we think is going to go down in Miami next week?
Oh, my God. I can't even think about Miami next week. I want to get through the weekend first. But I love the way that you went at Ken Cuccinelli on this idea that DOJ is both right to be exploring this and also extremely political and too political, and everyone needs to be reformed there. I think that that's a contentious point that I hope more Republicans are pressed on, especially now that the indictment itself is out there and unsealed. The fact that he's on tape, theoretically, according to this indictment, it makes it so much harder for Republicans to argue.
Yeah, the facts, when they came out this afternoon, up until then it was theoretical, hypothetical, anonymous sources they could say, they didn't believe it. Now it's on paper. And Doug, how do Republicans thread that needle? On the one hand, they need to argue that this is politicized somehow, but this indictment lays out a very difficult set of facts, as you just heard Ken Cuccinelli say.
Yeah, and I think probably to Ali's chagrin, I think the smartest Republicans haven't said anything yet.
Much.
It's very easy to get out there. I know. I've been watching. It's very easy to get out there and be, all pro Donald Trump all the time. But the ones who are waiting to see what the details are. So they're looking at this indictment. It's why we haven't heard from Mitch McConnell. I think is probably the most important Republican to hear from. We haven't heard from John Thune yet.
Right.
My guess is they're going to be a bit more critical than we've heard from some of the House Republicans.
We've heard a lot of House Republicans, but Senate Republicans, not so much. They're waiting to see.
You can see where this is going to go, though, with Cuccinelli's interview, which he just did, which is that they want to do the hypocrisy hit. They want to hit Biden as if they were somehow the same behavior. Yeah. One is they're trying to absolve. They don't want to discuss his behavior. So you're going to see that. Can you even acknowledge some of the facts in the case? Can you talk about them? That he could have absolved himself of this case. He could have resolved it at any point. He chose not to. He hid it intentionally, purposefully. He tried to deceive his lawyers and tell his lawyers to do illegal acts. So I think the behavior of Trump, as more details spill out, are going to compel more Republicans to talk about it. But I think if I look at their strategy, they're trying to play this hypocrisy game as if Biden's behavior is the same as Trump, and that's a loser, I think.
Right, and a question I'll ask you about, Miami next week, the spectacle that we could potentially see, on Tuesday. What do we think is going to happen? There's already Vivek Ramaswamy already said he's going to go down there. Do you expect this to be a rallying cry for Republicans, much like they tried to do in Lower Manhattan? Didn't quite happen, but it was. I was there, briefly, and Marjorie Taylor Greene went there, and granted, there wasn't a huge crowd. But does this change in Miami-Dade County?
I don't think we know yet, but obviously it's a concern. And if you go back to New York, you had Kevin McCarthy and other Republicans saying, "Don't protest." And why do they not want Republicans to protest in defense of Donald Trump? Because of the protest, which led to much other things, just a few blocks from here on January 6th.
Ali, I'll give you the last word. Reading this indictment, what went through your head, and just how stunning was this?
I mean, just the fact that he asked at one point to his attorneys, isn't it better if we say we don't have the documents?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yes, it would be better if you didn't have the documents, but you can't lie to the feds. And certainly that's one of the ways that we saw the special counsel here able to pierce attorney-client privilege, because you can't use your lawyers to try to do crimes. This is a conversation we had when we were covering the January 6th insurrection and the committee hearings. This is a common thread that we see Donald Trump and the way that he tries to use the people around him. And I think that, again, that entire document, the 40-plus pages that we all spent speed reading through today, has so many different bullets in it that are damning alone, but taken in conjunction are huge.
Ali, thank you so much. And Doug and Foz, thank you so much for being here on this historic day, a very busy news day here in Washington. Thank you all for helping us unpack it. We're back Monday with more Meet the Press Now, and our coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Schwartz, and here are the stories we're watching tonight. Storms keep coming.
Hey, podcast fans, ready to unlock our true crime?
Next, we are live with every angle, including this big question in the breakdown. If Mr. Trump wins back the White House, could he just pardon himself? We've got the TLDR in a minute. There's some other news we're going to get to tonight, too, including some cautious optimism on Wall Street tonight. The market's touching a so-called skinny bull market. Good news for investors, maybe, but we'll get into whether that's good news for your money. Then the dangerous smoke from those Canadian wildfires is finally starting to clear up in the Northeast. We'll explain when tens of millions of us might be able to get out from under all those alerts. And in tonight's original, we're taking you to Oregon with a controversial new law designed to crack down on homelessness. How some cities are trying to solve this crisis, with the details later on in the show. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and I want to show you right out of the gate here the documents at the heart of those 37 federal counts former President Donald Trump now faces as part of that indictment against him that's just been unsealed. I want to show you here the boxes stacked up on this gold-lined stage, right, in a bathroom, in one instance, right next to a shower. These boxes apparently filled with dozens upon dozens upon dozens of classified documents that include some very sensitive, legit serious sensitive national security information. Some of it's literally spilling out to the floor in some of these shots. The DOJ says these documents are not supposed to be there at Mr. Trump's personal home in Florida. So the big question, did Donald Trump know he shouldn't have had them? Explosive new evidence suggests he knew exactly what he was doing. According to this indictment, Mr. Trump told multiple people at his New Jersey golf club a highly confidential and secret Pentagon plan, said that he could have declassified it as president, but now he can't. He said, even though this is still a secret. He says, as president, I could have declassified it. Now I can't. It's still secret. One of his attorneys remembered this moment when Mr. Trump apparently said to him, according to this indictment, wouldn't it be better if we just told them we don't have anything here? Them being federal investigators. And an attorney remembers him making a kind of plucking motion to a folder full of classified documents, interpreted to mean, hey, pull some of that stuff out before you hand it over. We're hearing from the special counsel tonight, Jack Smith, who is speaking for the first time since he got that job back in November. He was crystal clear. Listen.
We have one set of laws in this country, and they apply to everyone.
Mr. Trump denies he did anything wrong. He is now personally attacking Smith, calling him a Trump hater, a deranged psycho, Donald Trump's words. Remember the political component here. He is running for another 4 years in the White House. He's raising money. He's selling shirts that say, I stand with Trump, and the date these charges came out. Some Republicans are standing with him, including some 2024 opponents. A lot of them have criticized the Justice Department. At least one says he might pardon Trump if elected, but some are going a step further with what's being interpreted as calls to violence, like one congressman saying we've now reached a war phase, eye for an eye. We know you have big questions. Our team looks at what questions you have that you're looking up, as we're all trying to process this, frankly, extraordinary and historic moment. Some of which you want to know, for example, Donald Trump indictment. We've just laid out what that is. We're going to lay out the charges coming up in just a second. Donald Trump's response to indictment. You just heard that. Is Trump going to jail? We don't know, and we won't know for a while. Our panel's going to break it all down. We've got Ken Delanian and Danny Savalos joining us, and we're starting with In Miami with Ken. Ken, what is important here are all the details we're getting from this indictment that we did not know before. Things that connect the dots as to how the DOJ is making this case against the former president, who, of course, is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Walk us through some of the key revelations, because there are several important ones people should know about.
Well, let's start with this, Hallie. All along, defenders of Mr. Trump said, well, look, it's not like the president packed his own boxes. As it turns out, according to this indictment, he did, in part. That's one of the surprises here, that the indictment says that Mr. Trump himself participated in the packing of the boxes, some of those boxes that went from the White House to Mar-a-Lago, and he had an intimate knowledge of where they were inside the compound. But look, big picture here, there was a lot of, what this indictment shows, there was a lot of really good journalism about this case over the months. So a lot of the things that are in this indictment, we knew snippets of. But now we have the full picture, and it's even more devastating than the worst portrayals in the press. For example, this recording of Mr. Trump himself that you referred to, talking about this classified plan of military options against a country we know is Iran, sharing it with people not authorized to see it. That's one of two instances in this indictment that alleges that Mr. Trump shared classified information with people who didn't have a clearance. That's a big deal. Now, he's not charged with the crime of dissemination for some technical reasons, but it's a threshold question for some Republicans who might say it's one thing for a former president to have classified documents in his house. It's another thing, though, for evidence of him showing it to people who shouldn't have seen it. But this indictment really lays out the extent to which the documents that Donald Trump had were some of the most sensitive national security information there is. Things about America's nuclear program, about American and foreign weapons and ways to defeat those weapons, about sensitive intelligence sources and methods. The kinds of things, this indictment says, that if they're disclosed, can really threaten U.S. national security. And then you leave all that aside and you get to this obstruction conspiracy, which is sort of a separate thing. Once caught with the documents, this indictment says Donald Trump took pains and took steps to hide the ball and to keep the Justice Department from finding them and to lie to the Justice Department. And taken together, it's an incredible portrait of misconduct. Again, he's innocent until proven guilty.
Ken, you lay out some of the new revelations here. The meeting, for example, that Donald Trump apparently had, according to this indictment, where he showed somebody from one of his PACs, his political action committees affiliated with his campaign, like this map, right? You talk about his personal involvement here. What's also, I think, important to talk about, big picture from this indictment, are the documents themselves. What Donald Trump had, right? Information about United States nuclear materials, information about our military vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities of our allies here, multiple agencies. We're showing them here, the CIA, the NSA, the Department of Defense, that were affected, that had documents caught up in it. You've covered a lot of national security events over the last many years that you've been doing this. Where does this rank?
Look, I mean, on the one hand, it's not as bad as it could have been, right? Like, there's no allegation that Donald Trump was selling information to the Saudis. There's no allegation that any of this information got into the hands of foreign adversaries, although there's really no way to know that, given that they were stored insecurely at Mar-a-Lago. But in the context of the many cases I've covered over the years about people who got in trouble for mishandling classified documents, this is one of the worst fact patterns I've ever seen. And just last week, Hallie, an Air Force lieutenant colonel was sentenced to 3 years in prison for taking home some 300 classified documents, including 30 top secret documents over the years. No allegation that he shared them with anyone. No allegation that he obstructed justice. He got 3 years in prison. The fact pattern here is much worse.
What about Walt Nauta, right? This other person now who's been indicted in this document that we're finding out about.
It's a bit of a sad story. Walt Nauta, Navy veteran, loyal Trump aide in the White House, who went with him to Mar-a-Lago and became his sort of butler and body man, caught up in this, allegedly moved documents and helped Trump obstruct justice. But the thing is, we know from our own reporting that the Justice Department went to him months ago, and his lawyers, and offered him a deal to cooperate, potentially in exchange for a reduced sentence or immunity. We're not exactly sure. And he declined. He turned them down flat. His lawyers were paid for by Donald Trump's political organization. So now he's facing years in prison, charged with a conspiracy with former President Trump to obstruct justice, Hallie.
Ken Delaney live for us there in Miami, where obviously the spotlight is turning ahead of that arraignment scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, 3 p.m. Eastern. I'm sure we will see you there, Ken Delaney, and thanks. Let me bring in Danny Savalos now. So, Danny, Ken has laid out the significant pieces, the significant revelations from this indictment. We had Jack Smith coming out for the first time that we've seen him in this process in a brief defense of the charges being brought.
Jack Smith didn't really speak at the podium. He spoke in his team's indictment. I mean, the only real purpose, arguably, of going to the podium was putting a face to this indictment and thanking the fine men and women of the FBI and law enforcement that worked with him, which is pretty standard practice at these kinds of press conferences. But other than that, he said in so many words, and this doesn't always happen, but he was very direct. Read the indictment. There it is. It's in the four corners. And that's really the mission when you give when someone like Jack Smith gives a press conference like this. I did not expect any questions. He did not answer any questions. I expected it to be brief. It was brief. It was by the book. And why not? He and his team have produced an indictment that is full of facts. We are all still digesting them. And one thing that he didn't say that you can be reasonably assured is that he and a very large team of folks have gone over this indictment with a fine-tooth comb, and they believe they can prove every single fact in there, and they believe they have documents or evidence supporting each fact, each numbered paragraph in that indictment.
There is also Judge Aileen Cannon. She was a Donald Trump appointed judge who is going to be overseeing this case, at least initially. How should we be thinking about her?
I'm hesitant to say that just because a president appoints a particular federal judge, because they're all appointed by one president or the other, that somehow that alone could affect the ability of the judge to hear a case. It's kind of happened in the past. It would be a dangerous precedent to say that someone is automatically disqualified, because then the defense would have an argument, well, wait a minute. I appointed a number of judges. Why should they be disqualified if I happen to, by the spin of the wheel in the courthouse, end up with this judge? And then what do you do if the case goes on appeal? There are a lot of appellate judges that Trump appointed as well. So is it the same rule of disqualification? A hard and fast rule that a judge who was appointed by a president couldn't hear a case involving a president? I think that would create a lot of problems. If there is additional evidence of some kind of bias, then that should absolutely be brought to the fore. But generally speaking, I don't think that's should be a hard and fast rule. Another interesting thing, too, just a factoid, is that all defendants have a constitutional right to a jury trial. But as much as Trump may love this judge and maybe even want a judge-only trial with her, defendants do not have a constitutional right to a judge-only trial. The government has to also agree, and the government is not going to agree.
Really quickly, Danny, how should we be thinking about the new legal team, or at least partially new legal team that's going to be in place? Jim Trusty, who people might know, he's been out on TV. He was literally on the Today Show this morning talking with Craig, is out. So is John Rowley. Todd Blanche is in. Is it normal for somebody to shake things up 2 days before an arraignment on federal charges?
Candidly, I was very surprised by this. I thought Jim Trusty acquitted himself very well with Craig Melvin. I thought also Tim Parlatore was a good asset for the team. He has done very well in interviews, I thought, sounding at least reasonable and articulating well, let's just say the best defense they possibly could. I'm surprised those folks are gone, but that's not to say that Trump can't assemble a good team in their absence.
Yeah. Danny Savalos, thank you for that. Let me bring in now. We have laid out the legal landscape here. Let's talk about the political landscape. And with that is our Ali Vitale, who covers all things, everything as it relates to Washington. One of the things that I've been hearing, Ali, in the sort of minutes between being on the air and everything else as this has unfolded today from rival campaigns of Donald Trump has been a bit of a spectrum. I think on the one hand, I've heard it called potentially disruptive, serious. On the other hand, people are cautioning there's still a long way to go here. I think there are some campaigns who are hesitant to get locked into a position at this point when we know that there's still maybe something coming in Georgia, for example. That's a little bit behind the scenes. Publicly, you are seeing some candidates, right, who oppose Donald Trump, at least in this fight for the White House, come out and back up his accusations that the DOJ is sort of pushing this partisan witch hunt. Then you have somebody like Mike Pence, who is, I think, having a more subtle take. Here's what he said.
An indictment against a former president, I think, is going to be extraordinarily divisive at a very challenging time for American families. And I also believe it sends a terrible message to the wider world.
I mean, that I thought was one of the more nuanced reactions that I've seen from anybody. And it allows Pence the ability to pivot wherever this story goes next, because most of the people who have responded did so before they were able to read the indictment. I'm wondering if that changes anything for people, especially as it lays out that the Justice Department seems to have the former president not just having documents, but detailing what documents they were, detailing what agencies were impacted. And oh, by the way, he's also on tape, apparently.
So that's
a lot harder to argue with that way.
I mean, it's Donald Trump saying on tape, and that appears to be among the most damning pieces of evidence that the DOJ is laying out, saying, well, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't have it in front of me. Yeah. I know I'm not supposed to have these. Oh, I guess it'll be a secret kind of thing, which speaks to his mindset, speaks to intent. Yeah. When you look at the way that people are either rallying or not rallying around him, you look at this other component that has started to emerge, I think, bubbling in the last few hours here. And that is, for example, this pushback from one member of Congress on incitement of violence to a tweet referencing military maps that came out after the charges were revealed. We saw another conservative hardliner, member of the Freedom Caucus, talk about eye for an eye. This is a war phase here. Where does that go, Ali? Because I will tell you, I've also heard that piece of it, concern down the road about the potential for unrest.
And how can you not have that, especially because of January 6th? I think everything that we've seen from the former president, and we had this conversation in the aftermath of the Manhattan indictment. I can't believe we're talking about, oh, well, this is the second. But here we are. There was always that conversation of this is a man who has been at the center of, if not an instigator of, violence in a large scale that we saw on Capitol Hill on January 6th. Now there's a question about if that follows him at each of these indictments, because this is one, but there's probably two more that are looming out there and could come down.
Ali Vitale, thank you so much. I know lots to follow as you get out on the road, covering all of it. Appreciate it, friend. So we'll have more on the Donald Trump indictment coming up a little later in the show. But for now, I want to shift and talk a little bit about something else that is making big news today. And that is the reappearance of Joran van der Sloot, the man long suspected of having something to do with Natalie Holloway's disappearance. Today, he is in an American courtroom for the very first time, and he's pleading not guilty to the charges he faces. Van der Sloot is not being held, remember, for any charges related to the murder of Holloway or her death, but instead for extortion and wire fraud, for allegedly conning her mother into sending $25,000 for information from him about the location of Holloway's body. Vandersloot's court appearance coming after he'd been extradited from Peru just about 24 hours ago. Remember this video? An absolute scene there. Gives you a sense of how much the spotlight is on him and this case. He'd been serving a 28-year sentence for the murder of a different woman in Peru. Seeing Vandersloot on trial for anything having to do with Natalee Holloway's death may be a full circle moment for her family and for her supporters. Vandersloot was arrested twice, remember, for her murder, but released both times on lack of evidence.